Hey everyone! Welcome back to Supreme Harry. Get ready for an amazing tale. Harry used the Merlin-Slytherin blood pact to force every Dark Lord to swear allegiance to him. Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1, The Vault Below the Snake's Den. The war had been over for 3 months, and Harry Potter was bored. Not the comfortable, well-deserved boredom of a man at rest. It was the restless, itching kind, the kind that came from having been the axis around which a world-ending conflict rotated, and then suddenly being handed a certificate of gratitude and told to go queue at the ministry for his oral aptitude assessment like everybody else. He'd sat in that queue for 40 minutes before standing up, pocketing his number, and walking out into the grey London drizzle without a word to anyone. That had been 2 weeks ago. He'd come back to Hogwarts because it was the only place that felt honest. The castle didn't treat him differently. The staircases still moved without warning. The portraits still argued about things that had stopped mattering in the 15th century. And Headmistress McGonagall had handed him a key to the 8th-year dormitories with the particular expression she reserved for situations she was choosing not to comment on, which was, Harry had always felt, her highest form of respect. He was in the lower dungeons because he couldn't sleep. That wasn't unusual. He'd been wandering the castle at odd hours since September, following staircases that shifted into unfamiliar configurations, feeling his way through corridors that the map had never quite agreed with. Hogwarts had moods, like a living thing, and lately it had been in the business of showing him things. A door here. A passage there. Last week a room full of astronomical instruments so ancient the brass had gone green and the star charts showed constellations that no longer existed. Tonight it was a staircase behind a tapestry on the 4th sublevel of the dungeons, a level Harry was fairly certain most of the castle's inhabitants didn't know existed. The tapestry showed a serpent coiled around an oak tree, which he probably should have found ominous but mostly found interesting. He'd pushed it aside and found stone steps descending at a shallow angle into darkness so complete it had texture. Lumos, he said, and the light from his wand pushed back the dark just far enough for the next step. He followed them down for what felt like 3 or 4 minutes, which at a slow walking pace meant a considerable distance. The stone changed beneath his feet from Hogwarts' familiar grey flagstone to something older, darker, almost black, with a grain that ran in long parallel lines like it had been cut from a single enormous slab. The walls narrowed. The ceiling dropped. And then the stairs ended at a door. It wasn't a dramatic door, which Harry had learned over the years was almost worse. Dramatic doors announced themselves. This one was set flush with the wall, made of the same black stone, with a single marking carved into its center, a symbol he'd never seen before, but which his brain did something odd with, something itching and recognizant, like hearing a word in a language you only half remembered. 2 interlocking circles. One filled with a serpent. One filled with what looked like an oak branch, or possibly a wand. He put his hand flat against it without thinking. The stone was warm. That was the first wrong thing. Down here, this deep, it should have been cold enough to see his breath. Instead the door was warm the way a living thing is warm, and when his palm pressed flat against the symbol, something in the stone moved, not physically, not in any way his eyes caught, but he felt it. A pressure against his hand that pushed back with curious intelligence, like a dog pressing its nose against a fence. Then something bit him. Not hard. Not painfully. Just a sharp, precise sting at the center of his palm, like a pinprick, and when he pulled his hand back there was a single bead of blood welling up from the meat of his hand, perfectly round, almost black in the wand light. The blood hit the door before he could think to stop it. It spread. That was wrong too, it spread outward from the point of contact in thin lines that traced the carved symbol and then kept going, branching into patterns that hadn't been visible a moment ago, filling a network of channels carved so fine they'd been invisible under his light. The entire door lit up with it, a web of dark lines spreading across the black stone, and Harry stood watching with his wand raised and his heart doing something irregular in his chest that wasn't quite fear. The door opened inward. The chamber beyond was about the size of a large classroom. The walls were lined with sealed stone alcoves, each one containing what looked like a rolled scroll. In the center of the room was a single stone plinth, waist-high, and on it rested something that looked deceptively like a book. It was bound in dark leather that was clearly not animal skin, it had the faint shimmer of preserved dragon hide, but the color was wrong, too organic, too variable. It had no title on the cover. When Harry picked it up, which he did after approximately 4 seconds of deliberation because he was constitutionally incapable of not picking things up in situations like this, it was heavier than it should have been. He opened it. The first page was blank except for 2 names written in a hand so old the script was barely recognizable as English. Merlin and Salazar Slytherin. And beneath them, in the same hand, to whosoever holds this compact by right of blood, both lines, both truths, both powers meeting in a single vessel, we leave what we could not use ourselves. We were not the answer. We were only the architects. Do not make our mistakes. We made rather a lot of them. Harry stared at that last sentence for a long moment. Both lines, he said aloud, because sometimes thinking out loud helped and there was no one down here to judge him. He looked at the symbol on the door, the serpent and the oak, one in each circle. Slytherin and Merlin. Both. He'd known he was a Parselmouth. He'd thought that ended with Voldemort's death, but he'd been wrong. He discovered that in October when the garden snake at the burrow had started a conversation with him about the philosophical implications of legs, and he'd responded automatically before realizing what he was doing. What he hadn't known, what nobody had apparently thought to mention, was that he was a direct descendant of Merlin through his mother's line. He found that out on page 3 of the compact, written in the same ancient hand, calmly listing the bloodline logic that had governed the compact's dormancy for 15 centuries. Lily Evans, née Potter, née a lineage that traced back through 100 generations of muggle-born and half-blood witches to a village in Wales where a man named Emrys had lived and died and left more behind than anyone knew. Page 4 was a list of names. Most he didn't recognize. Some were historical, names he'd seen in textbooks connected to dark periods of magical history. And near the bottom, written in ink that looked fresher than the rest, as though the compact itself had added them in due course, Gellert Grindelwald. Tom Marvolo Riddle. Harry read those 2 names for a while. Then he read the rest of page 4, which explained in the precise, almost bureaucratic language of ancient magical law exactly what the compact did, what it bound, and what it required of whoever held it. He sat down on the cold floor and read the whole thing. He was there for 2 hours. When he came back upstairs, the sky through the dungeon's narrow windows was beginning to gray toward dawn. He walked to McGonagall's office, knocked, and when she opened the door in her dressing gown with her hair loose and a look of extreme displeasure on her face, he held up the compact and said, "I need your office for the morning. You might want to take a walk." She looked at the book. Her expression went through several phases. "Potter," she said finally. "I know. Where did you, the dungeons?" "4 levels down. Behind the tapestry." She looked at him for a long moment, then at the compact, then back at him. "I'll be in the Great Hall," she said. "I'll have them send up tea." "Thank you. Don't blow up my office." "I'll do my best." He went in, sat down behind her desk, placed the compact in front of him, and took a long breath. The instruction on page 6 was direct. To invoke the compact's authority over a bound name, the holder needed only to speak the name aloud while holding the book and willing the summoning. The bound individual would appear regardless of location, regardless of magical barrier, regardless of, and this was the part that had made Harry sit very still for a moment, whether they were living or dead. The compact could reconstitute. Voldemort had died. Truly died, in the way that Horcrux destruction and the killing curse rebounding and the body dissolving into nothing tends to produce. Harry had watched it. He'd felt it, felt the last of that dark connection go quiet in his own skull like a candle being snuffed. The compact didn't care. Tom Riddle was a name on the list. The list existed outside the normal parameters of life and death in the way that only something built by Merlin and Slytherin working together could manage. What it would summon was not a ghost, not an echo, the book was very precise about this. What it would summon was the man, reconstituted from the magical signature that death could erase from the physical world but not from the deeper record. Harry thought about that for a moment, the ethics of it, the sheer presumption of dragging a dead man back across whatever threshold he'd crossed. Then he thought about what Tom Riddle had done. What he'd spent decades doing. What he would, if left to whatever afterlife awaited him, spend eternity congratulating himself for. He opened the compact to the page of names. Tom Marvolo Riddle, he said, and meant it. The air in the center of McGonagall's office went wrong. Not dramatically, it didn't tear or split or produce light. It simply became denser, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the pressure drops and the world holds its breath. Then a figure stepped through the density the way you step through a curtain, and stood there, and breathed. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall in the way the diary had suggested Tom Riddle had been at 16, at 18, before decades of dark magic and Horcruxes had taken something intrinsically human and stretched it into something reptilian. This was the man before all that. Dark hair, sharp features, the kind of face that would have been called handsome in a cold, architectural way. Perhaps 20 years old. Perhaps younger. He looked down at his hands first. Then around the room. Then at Harry. His eyes were dark brown, not red, not the flat crimson of the thing Harry had faced in the graveyard and in the forest. Brown, and sharp, and processing everything with a speed that was almost visible. Potter, he said. Not you, not an epithet, not the hiss of Voldemort's particular hatred. Just a name, delivered in a voice that was controlled and measuring. Harry heard the effort in that control and filed it away. Tom, Harry said. Something moved through Riddle's expression. Not quite anger, it was more like the reflex of a man who'd spent decades flinching at that word, and was now examining that reflex with cold curiosity. You found the compact. I did. How long have you known about it? A few hours. How long have you known? I suspected its existence for 15 years. Riddle looked at the book on the desk, and Harry noticed that he didn't move toward it, that he seemed to understand instinctively that moving toward it was not something he could do without invitation. The compact's authority was already working. Not painfully, not obviously, but in the way gravity works, invisibly, completely, without exception. I found references in manuscripts that predated the founding of Hogwarts. But the activation condition made it inaccessible to me. Both lines. He said those two words with an expression Harry couldn't quite name, it was somewhere between intellectual respect and genuine fury. I couldn't activate it. I had Slytherin's line but not Emrys's. But I have both. Evidently. He studied Harry the way a naturalist studies a new species, not with hostility, but with an intensity that wanted to take things apart. You're Lily Evans' son. I investigated her lineage, once, when she was at Hogwarts. She was anomalously powerful for a Muggle-born. I should have investigated further. You were busy trying to kill people. Yes. He said it without apology and without the performative remorse that Harry would have trusted even less. I was. Is that what this is, justice? You found the compact and brought me back to, no, Harry said. This isn't justice. Justice is what the Wizengamot does, badly, in wigs. This is something else. Riddle went quiet. The quality of that quiet was different from the defensive kind, it was the quiet of a mind reassessing. Page 9, Harry said, nodding at the compact. You know what it says. I know what the references suggested it would say. Then you know what I need from you. Something complicated moved through Riddle's face. The compact's authority was one thing, it compelled presence, it enforced the basic architecture of the binding. But what Harry was asking for went further than the compact's mechanics. He was asking for a choice, which Riddle clearly hadn't expected. You could simply compel it, Riddle said. I could. But you won't. Not for this part. Why? Harry looked at him. Because I want to know if there's any version of you that can do this voluntarily. Because if there is, you're more useful. And because if there isn't, I want to know that too. The silence stretched for a long moment. What exactly are you building? Riddle asked. I don't know yet. But the compact isn't a cage. Merlin and Slytherin didn't build a cage. They built something they didn't have the right bloodline to activate, something that needs a Dark Lord's knowledge, and a Dark Lord's understanding of power, and a Dark Lord's ability to recognize other Dark Lords, working alongside someone with the authority to point all of that in a direction that isn't destruction. Harry leaned forward. You spent your whole life knowing more about dark magic than anyone alive. You wasted it. I'm offering you something to do with it instead. Riddle stared at him. You're 17 years old. Nearly 18. And you're offering the most powerful dark wizard of the century something to do with himself. Second most powerful, apparently, Harry said. The compact has 4 names. Yours is second from the bottom. That landed. It landed precisely the way Harry had calculated it would, not as an insult, which Riddle's defenses were calibrated against, but as information, which they weren't. Riddle's expression shifted through several things quickly before settling into something that was unmistakably interested. 4 names, he said. 4 names. I'm going to Nurmengard next. Grindelwald. Riddle said the name like he was tasting it, not afraid, but respectful in the way that a chess grandmaster respects a problem. And the 4th? I don't know yet. The 4th name isn't readable. Not to me. Something shifted in Riddle's posture. A tiny thing, a tightening around the jaw that wasn't quite visible. A name you can't read. Can you? Riddle's mouth thinned. No. Then I suppose we'll find out together. Harry picked up the compact and stood. There are terms on page 9. Read them. I want your answer before breakfast. He walked to the door. Potter. Harry paused with his hand on the doorframe. You're not afraid of me, Riddle said. It wasn't quite a question. Harry glanced back. No. You should be. I've had a piece of your soul in my head for 16 years, Harry said. I know what you're afraid of. That's a more useful thing to know. He left the door open and went to find the tea McGonagall had promised. He found it on a tray in the corridor, still hot, which was either magic or testament to how well McGonagall understood timing. He drank it on the stairs, looking out a narrow window at the grounds just beginning to catch the early light, and thought about what came next. Grindelwald was in Nurmengard, which meant international travel, which meant the ICW was going to have opinions. Harry had read enough of the compact to know that the ICW's opinions weren't going to matter much, but it was still polite to have a plan. He was composing one in his head when he heard footsteps behind him, measured, deliberate, and didn't turn around. Page 9, Riddle said. Harry heard him settle against the opposite wall of the corridor with the ease of a man claiming space in any room he occupied. The terms are more equitable than I expected. Merlin was a fair man. Apparently. He was a man who wanted results. Equity was instrumental. A pause. The 4th clause. The one about full disclosure of magical knowledge in service of the compact's purpose. That's not incidental. No. That's the point, isn't it? That's the whole architecture. There was something almost like admiration in Riddle's voice, thin as wire but present. 15 centuries of dark knowledge, bound and directed. Not suppressed. Not imprisoned. Used. Yes. And you hold the leash. Harry turned around. Riddle was standing in the corridor's grey morning light, the compact open in his hands, and he looked like what he was, a brilliant, damaged young man with too much knowledge and nowhere adequate to put it. The monster was gone. The monster had been a thing Riddle had built over decades, layer by careful layer. What was standing here was the thing underneath the monster, before all the construction had started. It was almost harder to look at. Not a leash, Harry said. An alliance. Enforced, yes. Compelled, yes. But the compact calls it an alliance. I'm going to treat it like one. Riddle looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at the page. This clause, he said, turning the book slightly. You're bound by it too. I know. You hold the compact. You hold the authority. And you've bound yourself by the same terms. I noticed. That's either extremely principled or extremely stupid. I've been told those aren't mutually exclusive, Harry said. Something happened to Riddle's face then. Just for a moment, a crack in the architecture, something genuine pushing through the careful construction of his expression. It looked, absurdly, like someone trying not to be amused. Very well, he said. He closed the compact and held it out. My answer is yes. Voluntarily. For what that's worth. Harry took the book. I think it might be worth quite a lot, actually. You're an idealist. I'm a pragmatist. I just have a better definition of what works. Harry tucked the compact under his arm. You should eat something. The house elves will bring whatever you ask for. And there are rooms on the 7th floor, I've arranged one. You arranged a room for me before asking whether I'd agree. I arranged a room for you before coming down to the vault, actually. I read fast. Harry started back toward the stairs. And Tom, the compact will hurt you if you try to leave the wards. Not a warning, not a gentle reminder. It'll hurt. So don't test that this morning while I'm busy. Where will you be? Sending owls to the ICW. I need to arrange a visit to Germany. He reached the top of the stairs and glanced back. And try not to terrify the portraits. They gossip. He went back to McGonagall's office, sat down, and wrote 3 letters. One to the ICW's office in Geneva. One to the German Ministry of Magic. One to Hermione Granger, which said, I found something interesting. Come when you can. Bring coffee and your big brain. He sealed all 3 and sent them with the school's owls, then sat back and thought about Nurmengard. The prison was in the German Alps, a black tower on a mountainside, visible for miles, designed by Grindelwald himself in the days when he thought he was building an empire and wanted the architecture to reflect it. After his defeat by Dumbledore in 1945, the ICW had repurposed it as its highest security magical detention facility, which was a slightly ironic outcome that Grindelwald had apparently found entertaining. He'd been the only prisoner in it for 30 years, and he'd apparently redecorated his cell. Harry was, if he was honest, more nervous about this visit than he'd been about Tom Riddle. Riddle he'd known in a sense, had shared a skull with for years, had faced across every kind of darkness. Grindelwald was an unknown. A man who'd shaped the first half of the 20th century through sheer force of vision, who'd been defeated not by cleverness or power but by the specific intervention of the only person whose opinion he'd ever genuinely valued. A man who'd spent 30 years alone in a tower of his own making, with nothing to do but think. 30 years was a long time to think. Harry didn't know what had come out the other end of that thinking, and that was the thing that made him sit up straight. He was still working through his approach when the door opened and McGonagall came in. She looked at the room, intact, no scorch marks, no structural damage, and then at Harry. I passed Tom Riddle in the corridor, she said, in the voice of a woman describing something she would need time to fully process. He was speaking to the portrait of Basil Fronsac. About 17th century arithmetic theory. Is that going badly? Basil looked like he'd never been happier. She sat down in the chair across from her own desk with a slightly disconnected air. Harry. What have you done? Something that needed doing. He pulled the compact across the desk and opened it to the first page. She looked at the names, Merlin and Salazar Slytherin, and something happened to her expression that moved through shock and landed in a strange, wondering stillness. "Both lines," she said softly. "Both lines. My mum's side goes back to Merlin's line. I had no idea. Nobody did, apparently. Or if they did, they didn't tell me." He said that last part without particular bitterness. There were too many things people hadn't told him to waste energy being bitter about each individual omission. The activation, my blood. It recognized both lines in me and opened the vault. The compact was already primed. He turned to page 4. "These are the bound names." She read them. He watched her face. The line of her shoulders changed when she got to Grindelwald's name, and changed again at Voldemort's, a complex compression of grief and something older than grief. "He's here," Harry said. "Tom. Upstairs." He agreed to the terms voluntarily. Voluntarily. The word emerged carefully. "I gave him the choice." Harry met her eyes. "I know what I'm doing, Professor. Or I know enough of it. Merlin and Slytherin built this compact for someone who could hold dark knowledge and not be destroyed by it and not use it for destruction. I think they waited 15 centuries because the bloodlines needed to converge in someone who'd actually done that. Who'd had a piece of Voldemort's soul in his head since infancy and not turned into Voldemort." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. "Then, the fourth name. Can you read it?" "No. Riddle can't either." Her face did something complicated. "Harry. If there's a name on that compact that neither you nor Tom Riddle can read, I know. That could be, I know, Professor." He said it quietly but clearly, and she stopped. "I know. And I'm going to find out. After Nurmengard." He closed the compact. "I need you to keep things stable here. Tom is bound by the wards, and he knows the compact will enforce the terms if he causes harm. But he's brilliant and he's bored, and bored brilliant people make their own entertainment." "I'm aware," McGonagall said dryly. "I taught him." "Then you know what to watch for." He stood. "I'll be back in 2 days. 3 at the most." "You're going to Nurmengard alone?" "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The look had several layers: concern, assessment, and underneath those, something that Harry had seen on her face precisely twice before. The first time was at his first Quidditch match, when she'd watched him catch the snitch in his mouth and understood for the first time what she had on her hands. The second was after the Battle of Hogwarts, when he'd come back from the forest. The look was, "I believe you can do this, and I'm furious about how much I believe it." "Come back," she said. "Always do." He picked up the compact and headed for the door. At the threshold he paused. "Tell Tom not to rewrite Basil Fronsack's arithmetic proofs. I know he'll want to, but Basil genuinely likes those proofs." "I'll pass that along," McGonagall said, in the tone of a woman who had not, at any point, expected her Saturday morning to develop this particular quality. Harry went down the corridor toward the Ollery, the compact warm under his arm, and for the first time in 3 months the restlessness was gone. Replaced by something he recognized better. Something that felt, if he was being precise about it, like purpose. The corridor was long and the castle was waking up around him, distant sounds of students and the deep structural creak of Hogwarts settling into its morning mood. Somewhere above him a ghost was singing, slightly flat. A first year was running with the peculiar urgency of someone who was definitely late to something. Harry walked through all of it, already thinking about a black tower in the German Alps, and a very old man who'd had 30 years to prepare for exactly this visit. He was nearly looking forward to it. Chapter 2, The Man Who Bent the World. Nurmengard was visible from 20 kilometers out. Harry had apparat to the nearest wizarding waypoint in the Bavarian Alps, a small, cold platform carved into a mountainside that smelled of pine resin and old magic, and from there he could already see it. A black tower rising from a ridge line the way a splinter rises from a thumb. Not tall by architectural standards, but placed with such deliberate precision on the highest point of visible terrain that it dominated everything around it. Every road, every valley, every other peak existed in relation to that tower. You looked at it and understood immediately that it had been built by someone who thought in terms of dominance. The ICW escort arrived 6 minutes after he did, 3 wizards in the grey robes of the International Magical Security Division, all of them looking at the compact under his arm with expressions that wanted to ask questions but had been professionally instructed not to. The one in front was a broad German which named Hoffmann, 50-odd, with the quality of someone who had stopped being impressed by things at some point in the early 80s and never fully recovered the capacity. She looked at Harry the way she probably looked at most things, directly, and without ceremony. "Herr Potter," she said. "Your documentation has been cleared by the ICW's senior office. You have 2 hours. I may need longer. 2 hours is what has been authorized." "Who authorized it?" "The Secretary General." "Tell the Secretary General the compact of Merlin and Slytherin supersedes his scheduling preferences," Harry said pleasantly, and showed her the book. Hoffmann looked at it. She looked at the 2 names on the first page. She looked back at Harry with the expression of a woman recalibrating. "I'll send a message," she said. "Wonderful. Shall we?" The path to the tower's entrance was a single track that switchbacked up the ridge through scree and frozen grass, and the 3 ICW wizards made the climb in the particular silence of people who had decided that conversation was not the right tool for this situation. Harry didn't mind. He used the time to organize his thinking. Grindelwald was 86 years old. He had been in this tower for 30 years. Before that he had spent roughly 20 years building and running the most organized dark magical movement in European history, more organized than Voldemort's in many ways, more ideologically coherent, terrifyingly so. Where Voldemort had operated on terror and pure-blood supremacy, philosophically thin, emotionally brutal, Grindelwald had operated on vision. He'd genuinely believed in something. He'd written about it, spoken about it, built an entire structure of magical thought around the idea that wizards and witches were meant to lead, not hide, and that hiding was a form of cowardice that would eventually destroy them all. Harry didn't agree with the conclusion. But he'd read enough history to understand that the argument hadn't been stupid. That was the man he was about to walk in on. Not a monster who'd given himself over entirely to darkness, but an intellect that had taken a coherent worldview to its violent and catastrophic extreme, had been defeated, and had spent 3 decades thinking about it. The tower's entrance was a single iron door, heavily warded, that opened onto a staircase. Hoffmann led them up 4 flights and stopped at a landing with another door, this one wood, old, with a small barred window set into it. "He is aware of your visit," she said. "How did he take the news?" "He laughed," said one of the other guards, apparently unable to help himself. Harry nodded, and went in. The cell was large by prison standards, which meant it was approximately the size of a generous sitting room. The window was real, not a charm, a wide, unbarred opening in the stone that looked out over the Alps with a view so spectacular it was either a cruelty or a grace, depending on your disposition. The furnishings were books, mostly, arranged in a way that suggested a mind that had long since made peace with its environment and begun to treat it as a study rather than a cage. Grindelwald was sitting in a chair by the window. 86 years and 30 years of imprisonment had done to him what time does to everything, worn away the excess, left the essential. He had been, by all accounts, strikingly handsome in his youth. There were photographs in history books, and Harry had looked at them. What sat in the chair now was old in the way mountains are old, in a way that had stopped being about physical state and become about something more fundamental. His hair was white. His face was deeply lined. His eyes, which Harry noticed immediately, were extraordinary, pale blue, different shades, one slightly darker than the other, and absolutely, completely alive with intelligence. He was looking at Harry with an expression of open, unguarded interest. Like a man who'd been waiting for a visitor and was pleased to find the visitor was interesting. "Sit down," he said, in English, accented but precise, the voice of a man who had spoken 15 languages and treated them all as tools. "You've come a long way." "Scotland," Harry said, pulling a chair from against the wall and sitting. He placed the compact on the small table between them. Grindelwald's eyes moved to it immediately. And stayed there, with an intensity that was entirely different from the polite assessment he'd been applying to Harry. This was something else. This was the look of a man seeing something he'd searched for and either never found or given up on finding. "Mein Gott," he said softly. "Then, in English, you activated it. 3 days ago. Both lines. Both lines." Grindelwald looked up from the book and back at Harry, and the pure intellectual hunger in his face was so naked it was almost uncomfortable. "Your mother. Lily Evans. I investigated her once, very briefly, in 1979, I was still receiving correspondence here, in those days, from former associates. They asked my assessment of the likelihood that a certain Muggleborn which was somehow unusually powerful. I told them to look at the maternal line." A pause. Nobody looked. "Voldemort said almost the same thing this morning." "You've spoken to Tom." Grindelwald's expression shifted to something drier, more amused. "How is he?" "Younger than I expected. Smarter than I'd hoped." "Yes. He always was." The amusement faded into something more complex. "He came to see me once, in 1945, before my defeat. He was 16 and he wanted my endorsement of his movement. I told him his ideology was philosophically bankrupt and his methods were the work of a man who'd confused fear for respect. He was not pleased. I imagine not. He called me an old fool. I told him he'd spend his whole career being defeated by people who loved something, because he'd never understand how to fight people like that." A slight pause. "I was right, as it happened. Though I was not immune to irony myself on that front." Harry looked at him. "Dumbledore." The word landed differently than most words. Grindelwald didn't flinch from it, but something settled in him, like a stone settling to the bottom of deep water. "Yes," he said simply. He picked up the compact from the table, or tried to. It moved slightly in his direction and then stopped, and he set his hand back in his lap with the easy grace of a man who had just been told a fact and accepted it. "It won't come to me," he said. "No. It will only come to you." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "And my name is on the list of bound lords. Page 4. Third from the bottom. And you want what the compact is designed for." He leaned back in his chair and looked at Harry with those asymmetric blue eyes, reading him the way Harry imagined he'd read battlefields, quickly, completely, noting the unexpected things. "Not control. Not punishment. You want what Merlin and Slytherin built the architecture for." "Tell me what you think they built it for," Harry said. A small smile. "You want to know how much I know before you commit to telling me anything." The smile widened slightly. "Smart. Careful. You have better political instincts than Tom, though I suspect you'd deny it." He turned to look out the window, at the mountains, at the cold blue sky. Merlin and Slytherin were friends. Did you know that? The compact implied it. More than friends, some sources suggest, though that's speculative. What's not speculative is that they spent 30 years working together on the theory that the greatest threat to the magical world was not external, not Muggles, not governments, but internal. The cyclical generation of what they called Magnus Obscurus. He glanced at Harry. Dark Lords. Each one more powerful than the last, because each one was essentially an arms race. Each generation of dark magic pushed the boundaries further, and the counter-magic had to follow, and the accumulation of that knowledge meant that eventually someone would push past a boundary that couldn't be recovered from. He paused. They built the compact to interrupt the cycle. To take the knowledge, all of it, all the accumulated dark understanding of every Magnus Obscurus, and bind it in service of something constructive rather than destructive. Under the authority of whoever could activate it. Yes. Someone who had both lines. Emery's line for moral authority, for the understanding of what magic is for. Slytherin's line for the knowledge of what magic is, in its darkest and most complete form. He looked at Harry with those extraordinary eyes. They were waiting for someone who had both inheritances inside them. Not just by blood, but by experience. Harry was quiet for a moment. "You've had 30 years to think about this," he said. "I have had 30 years to think about a great many things." Grindelwald's voice was dry again, but underneath the dryness was something that took Harry a moment to identify as honest weariness. "I've had 30 years to think about where I went wrong. Not strategically, I know precisely where the strategic mistakes were. I mean where the thinking went wrong. The foundational error." He looked at his hands, which were old and spotted and still. "I convinced myself that the direction of my vision justified the cost of the path. Any vision will do that to you, if you're not careful. It's the most seductive lie there is. Is that a warning?" "Consider it orientation," Grindelwald said. "You are about to hold more concentrated dark knowledge than any single individual in history, and you are 17 years old, and you are clearly quite confident, which is both your best quality and your most exploitable vulnerability. I am telling you the specific way that confident visionaries go wrong, because it is the only genuinely useful thing I have to offer you." Harry studied him. "You're not going to fight this? The Compact's authority?" "No. I've spent 30 years examining the Compact's theory in every text I could get delivered here, and the ICW's librarians are surprisingly cooperative when you're polite and show academic interest. The Compact is sound. More than sound." He touched its cover briefly, almost gently. "It's magnificent, actually. The depth of the spellwork. The way the blood bond is woven into something that transcends individual magical signatures. Emery's and Slytherin were not playing small games." He met Harry's eyes. "I'll agree to the terms. All of them. Including the full disclosure clause." "Voluntarily?" "Voluntarily." He said it without hesitation. "I have conditions, however." "Tell me." "I want to work. Not in a cell. Not under guard. I want access to materials, to a workspace, to other minds." He leaned forward slightly, and for a moment the old age fell away, and what was underneath it was the thing that had bent the world, that capacity for absolute focus, for total commitment to an idea. "I have 40 years of theoretical work in my head that has never been written down because there was no one here worth writing it for. I want to write it down. I want it to matter." "What kind of theoretical work?" "The architecture of large-scale magical coexistence. I spent 20 years building a movement based on the wrong premise, on domination. And then I spent 30 years working out what the right premise would look like." He sat back. "I believe I have it. And I believe it aligns with what you're building. But I need to be somewhere other than this room." Harry looked at him for a long moment. At the books. At the view from the window. At the extraordinary old man who had shaped a century and was sitting here, in the ruin of all he'd built, still thinking, still reaching. "You'll need to wear a tracking charm," Harry said. "ICW requirement, and I won't fight it. The Compact's authority will keep you from causing harm, that's not negotiable, and it's not something I'll soften. If you test the boundaries, the enforcement is not gentle. I'm 86 years old, Potter. I'm not testing boundaries. I'm done with that particular phase. I also need your word, freely given, apart from the Compact, that Dumbledore's name, his memory, his legacy, is not something you'll use against anyone here. Not as leverage, not as pain." Harry said it directly, watching Grindelwald's face. "He won't be a weapon in whatever this becomes." The silence that followed was the most significant silence Harry had yet encountered in what was shaping up to be a morning of significant silences. Grindelwald's face went through something deep and complicated and private, and Harry let it, and waited. Albus is not a weapon, Grindelwald said finally. His voice was different on that word, Albus, stripped of all the technique and precision, just a sound. He was never a weapon. He was the point. A pause. Yes. That is freely agreed. Harry nodded, opened the compact to page 9, and placed it on the table between them. Read the terms. Then sign. The signing mechanism, blood and will. Same as the activation. Grindelwald read the page. He read it carefully, the way a man reads a contract he's already intellectually decided to sign but professionally obligates himself to fully understand first. When he was done he placed his right palm against the page, and Harry watched the same thing happen that had happened at the vault door, the blood, the spreading lines, the deep structural shift in the room's magical texture as another thread was added to the compact's weave. When it was done, the compact felt different under Harry's hand. Heavier. More complete. 2 names bound, Grindelwald said, looking at his palm. 2 remaining. The 3rd I'll retrieve once you're settled. Harry stood, tucking the compact under his arm. I need to speak to Hoffman about the transfer arrangements. She won't like it. She doesn't have to like it. Harry moved to the door, then stopped. One more thing. The 4th name. Can you read it? Grindelwald looked sharply at the compact. Show me. Harry opened to page 4 and held it up. Grindelwald rose from the chair with less difficulty than a man his age had any right to. He moved with the careful economy of someone who had long since made a deal with his body's limitations, and crossed to where Harry stood. He looked at the 4th name. And something happened to his face that Harry had not seen there yet. Something that wasn't intellectual or measured or dry. Something that looked, if he was reading it right, genuinely alarmed. You can read it, Harry said. Yes, Grindelwald said quietly. Who is it? Grindelwald looked at him, and for the first time in the conversation the asymmetric blue eyes were not assessing or testing or measuring. They were simply, directly serious. Have you ever heard of a witch named Vara Malikova? He asked. No. No. You wouldn't have. She predates your textbooks. She predates most of mine. He looked back at the page. She's been dormant for approximately a century. The last magical signature attributed to her was recorded in 1919 in Prague. He paused. Before that, she was active for roughly 400 years. Harry stared at him. 400, she's not continuous. That's not how she works. She sleeps, for decades sometimes, and then she wakes in a new body, or the same body, depending on which theoretical framework you find more convincing, and she continues. He turned from the page and looked at Harry with absolute seriousness. She is not like Tom. She is not like me. She is not a wizard or a witch who chose darkness and built a movement. She is something that has been accumulating for 4 centuries, that has no ideology and no vision and no goal except continuation and expansion. She is the thing that Emrys and Slytherin were most afraid of. I believe she is why they built the compact. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the Alps went on being enormous and cold and indifferent. And she's been dormant for a century, Harry said. She was dormant. Past tense. Look at the name again, Potter. Look at what the ink is doing. Harry looked at the page. He hadn't noticed it before, or he'd noticed it and filed it away as a quirk of the old script. But now that Grindelwald had directed his attention, he could see it clearly. The 4th name was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way the minute hand of a clock moves, you never see it moving, you only see that it has moved. The ink was shifting. Reforming. Not disappearing, but becoming clearer, as though something that had been sleeping in the letters themselves was waking up and remembering how to hold its shape. She's waking, Grindelwald said. Harry closed the compact. He stood in Gellert Grindelwald's cell in a tower in the Bavarian Alps and held the compact of Merlin and Slytherin under his arm and thought very quickly and clearly about what this meant, and what it changed, and what it required. Then he went to get Hoffman. She was on the landing, as expected, and she had the look of a woman who had been receiving messages and not enjoying their content. "The Secretary General has," she began. "Grindelwald is being transferred to Hogwarts under the authority of the Compact," Harry said. "He'll need a portkey arranged within the hour, a medical assessment, and his books. All of them. Don't leave the books. Her Potter, Hoffman." He looked at her directly. Not unkindly, but without any give in it. "I'm not asking for permission or scheduling a meeting. I'm telling you what's happening. The Compact's authority is higher than the ICW's jurisdiction and the Secretary General's diary, and I need you to arrange the transfer because it would take me 3 times as long to do it myself, and we are now in a situation where time matters. Please." She looked at him for a long moment. The professionalism warred with something that wanted to push back on principle, and the professionalism won, which Harry suspected had been its habit for about 30 years. "1 hour, she said. "Thank you." He started back down the stairs, already pulling out his wand to send a message to Hogwarts. "And Hoffman, you did good work here. Whatever the ICW told you about this facility and this prisoner, you kept him safe and sane for 3 decades. That mattered." She said nothing, but when he glanced back she was standing a little straighter, and the professional neutrality on her face had softened by precisely 1 degree. The portkey back to Hogwarts was a battered German Bundesliga Quidditch pennant, which Harry suspected was Hoffman's small joke, and it deposited him and Grindelwald in the Hogwarts entrance hall at precisely 11 in the morning. Neville was there, which Harry had not arranged but was not surprised by, because Neville had a quality of turning up at important moments that Harry had long since stopped questioning. Neville looked at Grindelwald. Grindelwald looked at Neville. "This is Neville Longbottom," Harry said. "He's my right hand. Whatever I ask you to tell me, you'll tell him too." Grindelwald examined Neville with those blue eyes, and the examination went on slightly too long in the way that Grindelwald's examinations tended to, and then he said, "Your family was touched by the First War." "My parents were tortured by Bellatrix Lestrange," Neville said, without particular drama. "They're in St. Mungo's long-term ward." "I'm sorry," Grindelwald said. He said it simply, without the politician's reflex of loading apology with self-protection. "I don't say that because the Compact requires it. I say it because it's true." Neville nodded. "Good enough," he said. Then, to Harry, "Riddles in the library." He found a restricted section shelf that the cataloging charms missed, and he's been in there for 3 hours. "McGonagall thought you should know." Harry almost smiled. "What's he found?" 6 volumes of Pre-Founder's Dark Ritual Theory. He's already annotated 2 of them. "In pencil?" "In ink." "Of course." Harry turned to Grindelwald. "I'm going to put you in adjacent quarters to Riddles. You'll have all your books and a workspace. The wards here will be clear about what the Compact permits and doesn't, the castle enforces that itself. Any questions?" "1, Grindelwald said. "Tom knows I'm here. He will in approximately 20 minutes. The faintest amusement crossed Grindelwald's face. "That should be interesting." "I'm counting on it," Harry said. "Neville will show you to your rooms." Neville, to his considerable credit, simply said, "Right, this way," and started up the staircase as though escorting 86-year-old dark wizards through Hogwarts was the most natural Tuesday morning activity available. Harry watched them go, then went to the library. Riddle was exactly where Neville had said, tucked into a corner of the restricted section with 6 volumes arranged around him in a pattern that suggested architectural thinking. He looked up when Harry entered, and Harry noticed that the pencil/ink distinction Neville had mentioned was accurate. Every annotation in the open volume was in small, precise ink, which was either confidence or compulsion and might have been both. "Grindelwald is here," Harry said. Riddle's stylus, he'd apparently found one somewhere, went still over the page. I know. I felt the compact shift. He set the stylus down. He agreed voluntarily. Yes. Faster than I expected. He sat back. He's more pragmatic in old age than I would have predicted. He's more than pragmatic. He's been thinking productively for 30 years. Harry sat down across from him. And he's told me something about the fourth name. Riddle went very still. You can read it now. He can. I can't yet. Harry placed the compact on the table and opened it to page 4. Her name is Vara Malikova. She's been active across multiple centuries. Grindelwald says she's what Merlin and Slytherin were primarily afraid of. Riddle looked at the name. He looked at it for a long time, in the focused, utterly contained way that Harry had learned was not stillness but the opposite, a mind running very fast and very quietly. I know that name, he said. Harry said nothing. He waited. It's in the Slytherin manuscripts. The ones in the chamber. Before you destroyed it, there was a library beneath the Chamber of Secrets accessible only through Parseltongue. I never found all of it. He kept looking at the name. In one of the manuscripts, Slytherin wrote about a magical phenomenon he called the recurring dark, a concentration of dark power that didn't behave like a person, that accumulated rather than developed, that grew stronger with each cycle of dormancy and waking because it retained everything it had learned in previous incarnations. He looked up. He was afraid of it. Salazar Slytherin, who was afraid of essentially nothing, was frightened of it. And it's been dormant for a century. But waking. Riddle's eyes went back to the name, to the slow shifting of the ink. Do you understand what that means in practical terms? A dark magical entity that has been accumulating for 400 years, waking into the current world, with no ideology or movement to slow it down, no human vanity, no politics, no ego to exploit. Just 400 years of accumulated dark power and knowledge. He paused. Tom Riddle at his peak was arguably the most dangerous dark wizard since Grindelwald. Whatever this is makes us look like students. Harry looked at him. And yet here you are. On the list. Riddle met his eyes, and for a moment the complex architecture of who they were to each other was in that look, the years of attempted murder and the peace of soul and the boy who had survived everything Riddle had thrown at him and was now sitting across from him in a library, asking him to think. Yes, Riddle said. Here I am. On the list. A pause. I spent 40 years building dark power toward an end that turned out to be empty. If you're asking whether I have the specific knowledge necessary to understand and potentially counter something like Malikova, he reached for the stylus again. I do. That's what this morning's reading has been about, actually. I recognized the problem before you told me the name. Harry stared at him. You anticipated this. I recognized the shape of it in the compact's architecture. The fourth name was always the point. Emrys and Slytherin built the whole thing for the fourth name. He opened the volume in front of him to a page dense with text and turned it toward Harry. Look at this. 6th century dark theory, Frankish school. The recurring dark wasn't a legend or a metaphor. It was a documented phenomenon. At least 3 confirmed instances in the first millennium alone. Harry looked at the page. His Latin wasn't perfect but it was better than it had been, and the word Malikova appeared twice in the dense text with annotations that predated the compact's creation. She's real, Harry said. She's very real. And she's waking. Riddle closed the book. So. What are you going to do about it? Harry was quiet for a moment. Build what the compact was designed for, he said. Everything that was supposed to wait until the fourth name woke up, all the accumulated dark knowledge, all the understanding of power and its limits, it gets used for this. For stopping her. And if stopping her requires things that, whatever it requires, Harry said. That's what the compact is. That's why Merlin and Slytherin didn't hedge it with limitations on method. They knew what they were building it for. Riddle looked at him with those dark, sharp eyes, and what moved through his expression was something Harry was certain he'd never expected to see there. Something that wasn't calculation, wasn't strategy, wasn't the performance of cooperation. It was the look of a man who had spent his entire existence reaching for power and finding it hollow, finding that the architecture he'd built was magnificent and purposeless, and had just been shown what it was for. "All right," he said. "Then we'd better start working." "We'd better," Harry agreed. He reached for the nearest volume and pulled it toward him. "Where's the Frankish school section?" "Third shelf from the left." Riddle picked up his stylus. "And Potter, the annotation system I've been using. Learn it. Your marginal notes are going to need to integrate with mine. Your marginal notes are in a code I don't know. I'll teach you. It'll take 20 minutes. Harry opened the volume. "Fine. Go." Outside the library windows, the castle's grounds were golden in the late morning light, and somewhere upstairs an 86-year-old dark wizard was being shown to a room by the most steadfast person Harry knew, and the compact on the table between them was warm, and the fourth name was moving, and everything that had been building for 15 centuries was, finally and quietly and with the momentum of something enormous, beginning. Chapter 3, What Neville Longbottom Said to a Dark Lord. The first time Tom Riddle and Gellert Grindelwald were in the same room, they argued about furniture. Specifically, about whether the large oak table in the room Harry had designated as the compact's working space, a broad, high-ceilinged chamber on the 6th floor with good windows and enough wall space for the maps and documents that were already accumulating, should be pushed against the north wall to maximize floor space, or kept central to facilitate collaboration. Riddle wanted it against the wall. Grindelwald wanted it central. They had been disagreeing about this for 6 minutes when Harry walked in, looked at both of them, picked up one end of the table, and moved it to the exact middle of the room. "Central," he said. "More chairs." Neither of them argued. Riddle went back to his annotated volumes. Grindelwald sat down and opened a notebook he'd already apparently filled a third of. Harry had been watching them for 3 days now, and what he'd observed was this: they were nothing alike, and they understood each other completely. Where Riddle was precise and cold and organized his thinking in structures, hierarchies, taxonomies, everything slotted into its proper category, Grindelwald was expansive and associative, ideas tumbling into each other, connections made across vast distances of theory. Riddle's annotations were coded and numbered. Grindelwald's filled every margin in 3 languages and occasionally onto the backs of unrelated documents that happened to be nearby. They drove each other absolutely mad and were more productive together than either was alone. Harry had noticed this and chosen not to comment on it. What he had commented on day 2, was the ward boundary. Riddle had tested it, not aggressively, just thoughtfully, the way you'd press a bruise to understand its exact dimensions. He'd walked to the edge of the Hogwarts grounds at 11:30 on the second night and stood there for approximately 10 minutes, and the compact had made its position clear without any intervention from Harry. He'd come back to the castle looking like a man filing information, which was essentially what he was. "Satisfied?" Harry had asked, the next morning. "It's thorough," Riddle said. Whoever wove the enforcement mechanism had a sophisticated understanding of will binding. The blood bond architecture is good. Don't test it again. Harry pushed a cup of tea toward him. "It hurts more the second time." Riddle had taken the tea and said nothing further, which Harry was beginning to understand was his version of agreement. Grindelwald had not tested the wards at all. He'd sat in his new room the first night and read, and the next morning he'd been at the working table before anyone else, and he'd said, when Harry appeared, "There's a breakfast tray outside the door that your house elves apparently feel personally responsible for. I've eaten mine. Yours is getting cold." Harry had eaten his breakfast and asked about the Malakova manuscripts, and they'd worked until dinner, and it had felt, in a way that Harry couldn't entirely explain, like something clicking into place. The problem was Hermione. She arrived on day 4 in the way she arrived everywhere, slightly breathless, carrying too many books, already mid-thought. Harry met her in the entrance hall and she talked for 30 seconds about the Hogwarts Express connection times before she stopped, looked at him, looked at the compact under his arm, and said, "How bad?" "Not bad." "Complicated." "How complicated?" "Come see the working room." She came. She walked in. She looked at Tom Riddle on one side of the table and Gellert Grindelwald on the other, both of them annotating documents, both of them ignoring her arrival with the particular focused rudeness of people who were genuinely absorbed in work rather than being performatively dismissive. She turned to Harry. Her expression was doing something very specific, the thing it did when she was processing information faster than social convention could keep up with. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were going very quickly between the two men and the compact and Harry. "Outside," she said. "Hermione, outside, Harry." They went into the corridor. She shut the door with the precision of someone who wanted very much to slam it but had elected for control. "You have Tom Riddle and Gellert Grindelwald doing homework in a room at Hogwarts," she said. "Research." "Harry. I know what it looks like." "Does it look like you've lost your mind?" "Because from where I'm standing, they're bound," Harry said. "Both of them." "By the compact, voluntarily." "Hermione, the compact is real. Merlin and Slytherin built it together, Merlin through my mum's line and Slytherin through Parseltongue. It's been dormant for 15 centuries waiting for someone with both bloodlines, and that person is me, and there's a fourth name on the list that is waking up right now and is something that makes both of those men look like first years." She stared at him. "Tell me everything," she said. He told her. It took 45 minutes, at the end of which they were sitting on the corridor floor because she'd slid down the wall somewhere around the explanation of the fourth name, and he'd sat down next to her because the floor was as good as anywhere. She'd asked 11 questions during the explanation. That was 3 fewer than usual, which told him she was processing at a deeper level than normal and hadn't had the space to form all her questions yet. "Vara Malikova," she said, when he finished. "Yes. I've heard that name. Or, not heard it. Read it." She pressed her fingers against her temple. "In A History of Magical Catastrophe, there's a section about the Prague incident of 1919. A series of magical collapses across 3 countries in 5 days. The ministry's official record attributed it to dark magic of unknown origin, but there was a footnote, it was a very small footnote, which is why nobody, the footnote cited a name. Malikova." She looked at Harry. "The author called it an emergence event. She was waking up in 1919. And then she went dormant again. Something stopped her in 1919. Hermione was very still in the way she got when a conclusion was forming. Or someone. Grindelwald was active in 1919. She looked at him. "You think he stopped her?" "I think it's worth asking." Harry stood, offering her a hand up. "That's why they're in there. Grindelwald knows more about Malikova than anyone alive except possibly Riddle, and Riddle found manuscript references yesterday that predate the compact. They're building a picture." Hermione took his hand, stood, and smoothed her robes with the automatic gesture of someone collecting herself. "All right," she said. "All right? I have 17 concerns that I'm going to list for you later, in writing, with citations. But all right. I'm in." She looked at the door. "And Harry, keep me in the room. I'm not sitting outside while those two build the theoretical framework alone. Whatever they know about dark magic, I guarantee I'll see things in it they've missed." "I was counting on that," Harry said, and opened the door. She walked in and sat down at the table without preamble. She opened the nearest document, Grindelwald's notebook, and read the top page. Then she said, in the direct, clear tone she used when she'd already decided to be collegial and was getting on with it, "Your notation for recursive dark power accumulation is ambiguous. You've used the same symbol for compounded inheritance and for direct accumulation. They're different mechanisms and conflating them will corrupt your projections." Grindelwald looked up. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his pen. "Show me. I need a clean page." He tore one out and passed it to her. Riddle, across the table, had gone still in the way he did when something interesting was happening that he was pretending not to track. Harry sat down, opened the compact, and got back to work. That was how the working room ran for the next 3 days. And it was fine. It was, if Harry was completely honest, better than fine. The productive energy in it was real, and the progress was real, and watching Hermione dismantle 2 centuries worth of dark theory with her particular brand of intellectual precision and rebuild it into something cleaner and more accurate was one of the most satisfying things he'd ever witnessed. The problem came on day 7, and its name was Neville Longbottom. Not that Neville was a problem. Neville had been quietly essential since the beginning, running information between Harry and McGonagall, managing the practical logistics of having 2 of history's most notorious dark wizards in residence, and doing all of it with the easy, unruffled competence of someone who had fought a war and developed a healthy sense of proportion about what actually constituted a crisis. But Riddle had noticed Neville. And had been watching him, in the particular way Riddle watched things he hadn't yet categorized. Harry had seen it happening and had been waiting for whatever it produced. It produced, on the morning of day 7, the following conversation. Harry was not in the room when it started. He was with McGonagall in her office, going through the list of precautions for the incoming DMLE liaison who was scheduled to review the compact's legal standing under British magical law. He came back to the working room to find Hermione and Grindelwald both looking with unusual focus at their respective documents, which was the particular quality of attention that meant 2 people were very carefully not looking at something else. He looked at something else. Neville was standing at the end of the table. Riddle was sitting at the other end, which put approximately 12 feet between them, and the quality of that distance was very specific. It was the distance of 2 people who had each elected not to change it. "You're not afraid of me," Riddle said. The same words he'd said to Harry on the first morning, but the tone was different. With Harry it had been assessing. With Neville it was, Harry listened carefully, genuinely puzzled. "Why would I be?" Neville said. "I killed people you loved. You killed people everyone loved. That's kind of the whole thing." Neville set down the stack of documents he'd been carrying. "Bellatrix killed my parents. You created Bellatrix, more or less. But you're bound by the compact and you're being useful, so I'm not going to spend energy on being afraid of you. Or angry. I've got better things to do with both." Neville pulled out a chair and sat down with the ease of someone who decided the conversation was happening and he might as well be comfortable for it. "What I am is curious about something." Riddle looked at him with those dark eyes. "What?" "When you were at school, at Hogwarts, I mean. Not at whatever you were doing in the years after. When you were here and you were just Tom Riddle who was brilliant at everything." Neville paused. "What did you actually like? Not what you studied because it was useful. What did you actually enjoy?" The room went even quieter. Grindelwald had stopped pretending to read his document. Hermione had her quill pressed against her page but wasn't writing. Riddle stared at Neville for a long moment with the expression of a man who had been asked a question so unexpected it had temporarily disabled his ability to be strategic about his answer. "Transfiguration," he said finally. "Yeah. The theory of it. The deep logic. Most people treat it as mechanical, change the intention, change the form. But there's a philosophical dimension to transfiguration that almost nobody engages with. The question of whether the transformed object retains any continuity of being with the original." He paused, apparently somewhat surprised to find himself talking. Dumbledore understood it. His theoretical writing on transfiguration from the 1930s was the best work of its era. Neville nodded. "I was never much good at transfiguration." "What were you good at?" "Herbology. Plants." A small smile. "Not very useful for this particular project. You might be surprised." Riddle glanced at the documents on the table, specifically at a section concerning the botanical components of Malakova's known ritual signatures, which they'd identified 3 days ago and hadn't yet found anyone with the right expertise to analyze. There's a component in Malakova's recorded emergence events that appears to involve a specific variety of magical plant tissue. None of the three of us have the relevant knowledge base. Neville looked at the section. He picked it up and read it with the focused attention he gave to anything plant-related, the slight tilt of the head, the stillness of someone reading in their native language. "This plant tissue," he said. "Where is it sourced?" "The 1919 incident." "From 3 separate accounts. Prague, Munich, and a village in the Carpathian range whose name doesn't translate consistently across the sources. This description here," Neville pointed at a line. "This isn't any plant I can identify from the description alone. But this word," he pointed at the German text in Grindelwald's version of the account. "What does Dunkelwurzel mean?" "Dark root," Grindelwald said, without looking up. He had given up pretending to read. "It's a colloquial term. Several possible species. In magical herbology there's a genus called Obscura radix, dark root, essentially the same thing. 7 species. Most of them are benign. 2 of them are controlled substances because they concentrate magical energy and store it in their root systems in a form that can be extracted." Neville set the document down and looked at Riddle directly. "If Malakova is using those root systems as a kind of storage mechanism for accumulated power, like a battery she builds over decades and draws from during emergence, that would explain why the emergence events are preceded by widespread magical depression in the affected area. The plants are drawing magic from the environment and she's drawing from the plants." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of 3 very sharp minds all arriving at the same place at slightly different speeds. Riddle looked at Neville for a long moment. "How long have you been working on the botanical component?" "I read the file this morning when Harry gave me the stack to bring up." Neville shrugged. "It was obvious." "It was not obvious," Grindelwald said, with a slight emphasis that made the sentence a form of respect. "It's obvious if you know plants," Neville said. "Same way whatever you worked out about the frequency patterns in the emergence events was obvious if you know dark magic theory. We're all obvious about different things." Riddle looked at him again. Then he reached for a clean document and wrote 3 words at the top, "Obscura radix mechanism." He passed it to Neville. "Build the theoretical model. I'll cross-reference with the ritual signature analysis." Neville took the document and picked up a quill like he hadn't just been handed a research task by Tom Riddle, reconstructed Dark Lord, in a 7th-floor chamber at Hogwarts, like this was in any way a normal sequence of events. Harry exhaled quietly. Hermione glanced at him with an expression that said, "I can't believe that worked, also I can absolutely believe that worked." The morning proceeded. Grindelwald's contribution to the botanical discovery was to pull 3 texts from his personal collection that documented Malakova's known movements in the Carpathian region between 1870 and 1910, and to mark every reference to vegetation anomalies and local magical depression with a red pen. The correlation was immediately visible and immediately alarming. In every documented location, in the years preceding any emergence event, there was a consistent pattern: slow magical decline in the surrounding landscape, failing wards, weakening of ambient enchantments, and simultaneous reports of an unusual proliferation of low-growing dark-leafed plants along water sources. "She seeds them," Neville said, at about 11:30, looking at Grindelwald's maps. He said it the way you say something when the conclusion has been clear for a few minutes and you've been checking it from every angle. That's how she prepares a location for emergence. She seeds the Obscura radix variants, harvests over decades, builds the power reserve, and then wakes into it. Which means, Harry said, there are seeded locations right now. Wherever she's planning to emerge. Not planning, Grindelwald said. Already seeded. The seeding happens during dormancy, she seeds before she sleeps, in preparation for the next waking. The 1919 emergence in Prague was the end of a cycle that began with seeding sometime around 1890. He paused. If she's been dormant since 1919, she seeded before she went to sleep. Approximately 1915 to 1919. During the First World War, Hermione said. Yes. Which would have made the seeding remarkably easy to conceal. Europe in 1915 had considerably larger problems than unexplained vegetation anomalies. Grindelwald's voice was dry in a way that had something old and heavy underneath it. I was 17 in 1915. I noticed something unusual in 3 separate locations during that period. I noted it and moved on, because I was 17 and I was busy with things I now consider to have been a catastrophic waste of time. He said it without self-pity, but also without the deflection that self-pity would have required. Just a statement of fact about a young man who had been wrong about what mattered. You stopped her in 1919, Harry said. Didn't you? Grindelwald was quiet for a moment. I didn't know what she was. I was 23 and I encountered something in Prague that I could not identify and could not understand, and that was genuinely frightening. I fought it instinctively and won, or thought I won, and then it disappeared and I put it in my files as an unidentified dark entity and moved on. He looked at the map. I didn't win. I interrupted. She retreated and went dormant because the emergence was incomplete. The power reserve wasn't sufficient. Because you disrupted the seeded locations. Apparently. He traced a line on the map with one finger. I burned 3 areas of unusual vegetation in Prague in August of 1919. I thought I was being overcautious. It was, as it turns out, the most useful thing I did in that entire decade. Okay, Harry said. He stood up and planted both hands flat on the table, looking at the maps and documents spread across it. So we need to find the seeded locations. The ones she prepared before 1919. They've been sitting there for over a century, and if they're obscura radix variants they're slow-growing and hardy, and they've been accumulating this whole time. Which means wherever she emerges, her power reserve is going to be massive. Unprecedented, Riddle said flatly. And she's waking now. Which gives us, Harry looked at Grindelwald. Weeks, possibly. Perhaps less. He folded his hands. The Prague emergence in 1919 went from the first detectable signs of waking, which is what we're seeing in the Compact now, to full emergence in approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Harry looked around the table. Neville, who was already pulling a botanical reference text from the pile. Hermione, who was writing on 2 documents simultaneously, cross-referencing with a speed that was slightly inhuman. Grindelwald, who was unfolding a second map with the practiced movements of a man returning to something he'd been preparing for without knowing it. Riddle, who was building the ritual signature analysis into a theoretical framework with the focused intensity of a man who had finally found a problem worthy of his attention. Right, Harry said. Then let's work. They worked through lunch, the house elves sent up trays that mostly went cold, and through the afternoon, and by the time the light through the tall windows had gone amber and then pink, Neville had built a preliminary model of the obscura radix mechanism that Riddle called rigorous, which from him was the equivalent of applause. Hermione had cross-referenced the emergence event records with historical weather patterns and found a correlation between Malikova's activity and unusual atmospheric magical disturbances that gave them a predictive framework. Grindelwald had identified 6 potential seeded locations based on his 1915 to 1919 records and the new botanical model. 6 locations. None of them in Britain. She doesn't operate in islands, Grindelwald said. She needs broad, connected landmass. Ley line networks, continental magical substrate. Britain's insular geography makes it insufficient for her purposes. So she's in Europe, Harry said. Central Europe, almost certainly. Her historical patterns of operation are strongly concentrated in the Carpathian-Bohemian region. The magical substrate there is extremely old and deep, the ley lines run at depths that don't exist in Western Europe. He pointed at the map. If I had to choose the single most likely emergence location based on all available data, Prague, Riddle said. Grindelwald looked at him. Prague, he agreed. She went back to a known location, Riddle said, in the tone of a man identifying a familiar pattern. She was interrupted there in 1919. She seeded it again before she went dormant. She has 100 years of accumulated power in a location she's used before and where she knows the substrate. He looked at Harry. She's not going to change what works. It's a trap, Harry said. Yes, Riddle said. Probably. She knows someone will come. She has 400 years of experience. She knows that the compact's activation will draw attention to her name. She may have been waiting for the compact to activate. A pause. She may have been waiting for you, specifically. The room was quiet for a moment. Let her, Harry said. Riddle looked at him. She's been outlasting dark wizards for 4 centuries by being the thing nobody's paying attention to, Harry said. She's never had someone with the full compact, all the bound knowledge, specifically pointed at her. He looked at the map. She thinks Prague is a trap. We're going to go to Prague. We, Riddle said. All of us. You, Grindelwald, Hermione, Neville. Everyone in this room. Harry picked up the compact. The compact isn't just about binding dark knowledge, it's about deploying it. Page 11. This is what page 11 is for. Grindelwald leaned forward. You've read page 11. I've read the whole thing. Page 11 requires, I know what it requires. Harry closed the compact. 3 weeks. Less. We need to be in Prague before the emergence completes. Which means we have 2 weeks to prepare. He looked around the table. What do we need? Neville said, access to living specimens of Obscura Radix. I need to understand the extraction mechanism before we're standing in a field full of them. Hermione said, the ICW's restricted archive. There are sealed records from 1919 that will tell us how close Grindelwald actually got to the emergence before it retreated. I need to know what full emergence looks like so I can build a containment model. Grindelwald said, without looking up from the map, I need to speak to someone in Prague. A former contact who has been monitoring the magical substrate of the city for 30 years. She doesn't know what she's been monitoring. But she's meticulous and her records will be invaluable. Harry nodded. Riddle. Riddle had been looking at the compact since Harry had cited page 11. He looked up. The ritual signature of the Combined Compact Authority, he said slowly. On page 11. I need to understand its structural mechanics before Prague. Then read it tonight. I have been reading it. He looked at Harry. Potter, page 11 requires all bound lords to act in unified magical concert. Not cooperation, concert. The same way a spell cast by multiple wands in perfect coordination is stronger than the sum of its parts. But for this magnitude, he stopped. Then, with the precise reluctance of a man making an honest assessment that doesn't flatter him, we're going to need to practice. The admission sat in the room for a moment. Right, Harry said. We practice. Together, Riddle said, with a very slight, very controlled expression that suggested this was a sentence he had never expected to say. Together. Harry looked at Grindelwald. I haven't done combined work since 1942, Grindelwald said mildly. I'm slightly out of practice. You have 2 weeks, Harry said. Get back into practice. Grindelwald's slight smile was there and gone. Yes, he said. I suppose I do. The meeting ended at 7 in the evening. Neville gathered his botanical notes and the reference texts and headed for the greenhouses, because Neville did his best thinking with soil under his fingernails. Hermione started drafting the ICW access request, which she said she'd have ready by morning. Grindelwald sat back in his chair and looked at the maps with the expression of a man who had been handed back something he thought he'd lost. Harry stayed to put the documents in order. They had a system now, Hermione's system, color-coded and cross-referenced, and Riddle stayed without being asked. They worked in silence for a few minutes. The comfortable kind, which Harry recognized and didn't remark on. The Transfiguration, Harry said, without looking up from the document stack. Riddle glanced at him. What about it? When you were here. At school. Harry sorted the last document into its place. I get it, actually. The philosophical dimension. The continuity question. Do you? If you transfigure a cup into a bowl, is it the same object? Does the thing that made it a cup persist in some form in the bowl, or is the bowl something genuinely new? Harry looked up. I thought about it, once, in 5th year, after, he stopped. After what? Riddle said. After you possessed me in the ministry. I thought about it afterward. Whether something of you had persisted in me from that, the way it had from when I was a baby. Whether I was still wholly myself. He said it matter-of-factly, because it was a fact he'd carried for a long time and had made some peace with. I decided the bowl is the bowl. The cup is finished. But the transformation leaves a mark. The material remembers. Riddle was very still. What's your point? He said, in the controlled voice that meant the question wasn't rhetorical. That I don't know what you are now, Harry said. This version. Reconstituted by the compact from a magical signature, in a body that's 20-something, without the Horcruxes, without 40 years of dark practice making you less and less human. He picked up the compact. I don't think you know either. And I think that's the most interesting thing about this whole situation. He walked to the door. Get some sleep, he said. We start the combined practice tomorrow. Potter. Harry paused. Riddle was looking at the table. At his annotated volumes and Neville's botanical model and Hermione's color-coded documents. At the maps covered in Grindelwald's red pen notations. At all the assembled knowledge and the shape it was beginning to make. This thing we're building, he said. The compact's purpose. The framework. He looked at the table for a long moment. I spent 40 years trying to build something permanent. Something that would last. All of it. He didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. The shape of what all of it had produced was something he lived with. I didn't know it was possible to build something that actually, he stopped again. Harry waited. Mattered, Riddle said finally, quietly, like the word cost something. Harry looked at him in the evening light coming through the tall windows. At the young dark man with the sharp face and the annotated books, who had been the most dangerous thing in the world and was now sitting at a table trying to say something true for what might have been the first time in his adult life. I know, Harry said. That's why we're doing it. He left the door open behind him, and the sounds of the castle at evening came in, distant voices, a ghost passing through a wall, the deep structural warmth of a building that had been alive for 1,000 years and knew, in whatever way very old buildings know things, that something important was happening within it. Downstairs, Neville was in the greenhouses with his hands in the soil and a reference text propped open against a pot, and he was humming. Harry could hear it faintly through the stone. An old song, something his gran used to sing, completely tuneless. He stood in the corridor and listened to it for a moment. Then he went to find McGonagall and tell her they were going to Prague. Chapter 4, The Sleeper's name. Prague in November was the color of old silver. The city sat under a low sky that pressed the light flat and turned the river into something pewter and slow, and the old stones of the Stair Mesto, the old town, held the cold the way old stones always do, as if they'd been collecting it since the 14th century and had simply kept going. Harry had been here for 20 minutes and already understood why Malakova had chosen this place. There was something in the substrate, exactly as Grindelwald had said, something deep and old and humming at a frequency just below conscious awareness, like a sound you feel in your back teeth rather than hear. He stood on the Charles Bridge at 6:30 in the morning, the compact inside his jacket, and looked at the city. Behind him, Neville was eating a pastry he'd acquired from somewhere with the focused appreciation of a man who understood that carbohydrates before a crisis were sensible planning. Hermione was on her third review of the containment model on a rolled parchment she'd been refining since the port key. Riddle stood at the bridge's stone railing and looked at the water with the expression of a man reading it. Grindelwald was already gone. He'd slipped off the moment they arrived to find his contact, an elderly Czech which named Novotna, who had apparently been charting the city's magical substrate with obsessive precision since 1987 and who Grindelwald had described as meticulous, paranoid, and exactly what we need. The 2 weeks of preparation had been, in Harry's assessment, the most productive 2 weeks of his life. Not because everything had gone smoothly, the combined practice had been, initially, a disaster of competing instincts and incompatible magical signatures, but because they'd worked through it, and what had come out the other side was something Harry hadn't fully anticipated. The first day of combined practice had lasted 4 hours and produced 1 successful unified cast and 17 spectacular failures, several of which had singed the working room's ceiling in ways that McGonagall had been professional enough not to comment on. The problem was architectural. Riddle's magic was precise, hierarchical, built in towers. Grindelwald's was oceanic, broad, powerful, difficult to contain. Harry's, which he'd never really examined in structural terms before, turned out to be something else entirely, something that Hermione had described after watching it for an hour as adaptive. It didn't have a fixed form. It responded to the shapes around it. "You're not a structure," Grindelwald had said, on day 3, after a cast that had finally worked. He'd been breathing slightly harder than usual and looking at Harry with genuine interest. "You're a medium. You conduct. Is that useful?" Harry had asked. "It's why the compact chose you," Riddle said, not looking up from his notes. "A fixed structure can't hold 2 incompatible architectures simultaneously. Something adaptive can." That had been day 3. By day 12 they'd progressed to something that Harry could only describe as a working system, not elegant, not seamless, but functional and powerful in a way that had made Grindelwald, on the last practice session, go very quiet for several minutes before saying, "I believe Merlin and Slytherin would have been satisfied with this." Which was, from Grindelwald, the highest possible endorsement. Neville had finished his pastry. He brushed crumbs off his jacket and came to stand beside Harry at the railing. "She's here," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." Harry could feel it through the soles of his boots, or thought he could, which amounted to the same thing in practical terms. Something in the city's substrate was wrong in the way that a musical chord with 1 note slightly off is wrong. Present but jagged. Almost right. "Grindelwald's contact," Neville said. "Will she actually have what we need?" "Grindelwald says she's been mapping the substrate since 1987 and doesn't know why." Harry turned from the railing. "Which means for 35 years she's been doing exactly what Malakova wanted her to do, building a detailed record of the power reserve as it accumulated, completely unaware she was doing it." Neville absorbed this. "Malakova set that up deliberately. Malakova has 400 years of experience managing her own emergence. She's thorough." Harry started walking toward the old town. "She might have had Novotna under some form of subtle compulsion. We won't know until Grindelwald talks to her. If she was compelled, then she's a victim, not a collaborator, and we treat her accordingly." Harry said it without looking back, but the certainty in his voice was sufficient. Riddle fell into step on his other side, which had become, in the past 2 weeks, an almost unconscious movement. The 3 of them walking together had the rhythm of something practiced. "The emergence signature I've been tracking through the compact," he said quietly. "It accelerated overnight." Harry had felt that. "How far ahead of the 3-week estimate?" "Significantly." Riddle looked straight ahead. Grindelwald's original estimate assumed a standard dormancy to emergence cycle. But the compact activation changed something. The binding of Malakova's name appears to have agitated her. She felt it. She felt her name taken into the compact's authority. Whatever she is, whatever her relationship to self-determination, she felt that, and she's responding to it by accelerating the emergence. A pause. She may be fully awake by tonight. Hermione, who had been 3 steps behind and apparently listening to every word, said, that changes the containment model substantially. Can you adapt it? Harry asked. I've been adapting it for the last 20 minutes. She rolled the parchment and tucked it away. The short version is that the botanical removal has to happen before emergence, not concurrent with it. If she's fully emerged and drawing from the root system simultaneously, destroying the roots won't cut the power line, it'll just make her angry. Neville, Harry said. Already thinking about it, Neville said. I need to see the actual sites. The root systems will be mature, century growth. Obscura radix mature specimens can run 8 to 12 meters of lateral root spread. Removing them cleanly without triggering the extraction response is, he paused. It's technically complicated. Can you do it? Yes. No hesitation. They came off the bridge into the old town square, which was quiet at this hour, early tourists, a few locals, the astronomical clock doing its ancient business on the tower face above them. Harry had been to Prague once before, briefly, in the days immediately after the war when the European magical community had been holding a series of anxious congresses and someone had decided his presence would be reassuring. He hadn't found it particularly reassuring himself, but he'd gone, and he'd walked through this square and felt the city's age under his feet. Now he felt something else under his feet. A slow, deep pulse. Grindelwald appeared from a side street with the unhurried pace of a man who had never in his life walked quickly and saw no reason to start. Beside him was a woman, small, 70s, white hair cropped close, wearing robes that were technically Czech Muggle office attire with a layer of practical magical modification visible to anyone paying attention. She had the look of someone who had been told something recently that had significantly reorganized her understanding of the past 35 years. She also had an extraordinarily large roll of parchment under her arm that turned out, when she unrolled it on a cafe table 20 minutes later over strong coffee, to be a map. A detailed, layered, 35-year map of the old town's magical substrate, annotated in 3 colors with measurements and dates and notations so dense they formed their own texture. Novotna put it on the table without preamble. Here, she said, in English that was precise and slightly clipped. And here. And here. She pointed to 3 points on the map forming an imperfect triangle with the old town square somewhere inside it. The deepest concentrations. I thought I was mapping natural ley line confluences. Grindelwald tells me I was wrong. You weren't wrong, Neville said, leaning over the map. Ley line confluences are exactly where obscura radix takes deepest root. She chose those locations because they were already high energy. She didn't create the confluences, she used them. Novotna looked at him. You're a herbologist. Among other things. These 3 sites are in built-up areas. 2 of them are beneath existing structures. She pointed. Here, beneath the cellars of a building that has been in continuous use since the 14th century. Here, beneath the foundations of what was, in 1919, an open courtyard but is now a restaurant. Can you get us access? Harry asked. She looked at him with sharp brown eyes. I have access. I have had access for 30 years because I am a distinguished professor of magical substrate theory at Charles University and I have legitimate professional reasons to examine foundations. She folded her hands. What I need to know is what I'm sending you into. Into? Hermione said. She is not in the substrate, Novotna said flatly. I know what I've been measuring. Those 3 sites don't just contain root systems. There is a presence in them. She looked at Harry with the directness of a woman who had been frightened by something and had decided that the only sensible response to being frightened was to be extremely precise about it. In the last 72 hours, the presence has changed. It's awake. It knows I'm here. It has known for several years, I think, but this week it began to know actively. The cafe table was quiet for a moment. It used you, Harry said gently. Your mapping work. It needed a comprehensive picture of its own power distribution and it found the most meticulous scientist in the city and nudged you toward the project. You weren't compelled, it was subtler than that. It just made the work feel important. Novotna looked at him. Something moved through her face, the complex passage of a person confronting 35 years of genuine intellectual work and having to hold simultaneously that it was real and that it had been manipulated. "How do you fight something like that?" she asked. Harry placed the compact on the table. She looked at it. She looked at the names on the first page, Merlin and Salazar Slytherin, and her expression went through scholars' recognition and something beyond it. "The compact," she said softly. "I've read about this. The theoretical literature." She looked at Harry. "You activated it." "Yes. And these are," she glanced at Grindelwald beside her with a look that had, in the past 20 minutes, shifted from cautious professional cooperation to something more complicated. "Yes," Harry said. "We've come to stop her." "All 4 locations need to be addressed simultaneously," Riddle said, coming to stand at the table's edge and looking at the map. "The 3 root sites and the emergence point itself, which," he pointed to the center of the triangle, "is here." "The square." "The astronomical clock tower," Hermione said. "Of course it is," Neville muttered. "It's the oldest magical focal point in the city," Grindelwald said. 6 centuries of accumulated symbolic power. In magical terms, the tower acts as a conductor, it draws on the substrate naturally. For a system like Malikova's, it would serve as both emergence point and amplifier. "So we split up," Harry said. He looked around the table. "Neville, Novotna, the 3 root sites. Novotna knows the access points and Neville knows what to do when you get there." Neville nodded. Novotna nodded more slowly, but firmly. "Hermione, I need you at the square with the containment model. You know the theory better than anyone, and if something goes wrong with the timing, I'll manage," she said. "Riddle. Grindelwald." Harry looked at both of them. The morning light was thin and silver through the cafe window. "You're with me." Grindelwald picked up his coffee, finished it, and set the cup down with the serenity of a man who had decided that this morning was worth being awake for. "Of course," he said. Riddle had already folded a copy of the map and was putting it in his pocket. He didn't say anything, which was, Harry had learned, how he indicated full agreement. They separated at the edge of the square. Neville walked with Novotna toward the first site, and Harry watched him go with the particular feeling he always had watching Neville move towards something difficult, not worry, exactly, but the adjacent thing. The awareness of how much was carried in one person and how completely they were trusted with it. The square was filling slowly with morning. A tram moved along its track at the far edge. Pigeons navigated the cobblestones. The astronomical clock face looked down from its tower with the elaborate indifference of a machine that had been marking time for 600 years and intended to continue doing so regardless of whatever was happening at its foundations. Harry walked toward it with Riddle and Grindelwald, and the pulse in the stones under his feet was very clear now. It wasn't a physical sensation anymore. It was, direct. Like something that had been speaking into the substrate and had just shifted to speaking toward him. A pressure that wasn't magical force so much as attention. Being looked at by something very old and very awake. "She knows we're here," Riddle said. "She knew before we arrived," Harry said. He was right. Because when they reached the base of the clock tower, the door to the staircase was open. Not broken, not forced. Open, and the darkness inside it was not the ordinary darkness of an unlit staircase. It had depth. Harry stepped through without pausing. The stairs were narrow and spiraled upward in the way of very old towers, and the darkness resolved around them as they climbed, not into ordinary shadow but into something that had its own texture, its own quality. The temperature dropped steadily. "Halfway up," Riddle said, quietly, "the root system below us is active. I can feel the extraction running. All 3 sites. All 3. She's drawing simultaneously." That meant Neville hadn't reached the sites yet or hadn't cleared them yet, which meant the power reserve was still fully intact. Harry filed this and kept climbing. The chamber at the top of the tower was circular, which the architectural plans would have suggested. It was full of clock machinery, great brass wheels and gears that moved with the slow certainty of something ancient still doing what it was built for. And in the center of the machinery, standing with the perfect stillness of something that had not moved in a very long time and was now moving, was Varra Malikova. She looked like a woman. That was the thing, she looked like a woman, which Harry knew intellectually was not quite accurate but which his instincts had to process through anyway, because 400 years of accumulated dark power had decided, at some point, to take a form that looked like a tall woman in her 50s with dark eyes and an expression of complete calm. She looked at Harry first. "The boy with both lines," she said. Her voice had the quality of the substrate under his feet, not the timbre of one person's voice but something that suggested voices, plural, compressed into one. "I felt the compact bind my name. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile. I've been waiting for the compact to activate for quite some time." "So I've been told," Harry said. She looked at Riddle and Grindelwald then, and her expression did something complex and unhurried. "And the Bound Lords," she said. "Tom Riddle. I remember 1970. You passed through Prague in the early summer. I was dormant but I was aware. I felt something extraordinary in the city for 3 days. That was you." Riddle said nothing. But he was watching her with an attention so complete it had vacated his face entirely. "And Gellert," she said. And here, for the first time, something in the compressed voice's quality of her tone shifted, just a fraction, just enough to be different. 1919. You burned my seedlings in Vinohrady. I had to wait another century." "I know," Grindelwald said simply. "You were very young." "I was." He held her gaze with the ease of a man who had long since stopped being intimidated by the magnitude of things. "I'm not anymore." She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes, and what Harry saw in her face, and it took him a moment to be sure he was reading it correctly, was something close to longing. Not human longing, not exactly. But the recognizable shape of it. A very old thing looking at something it had encountered before and remembering the encounter. "You're going to try to bind me into the compact," she said. She looked back at Harry. "That's what the compact was built for. That's what Merlin and Slytherin designed the fourth position for." Her tone was not afraid. It was philosophical. The tone of someone who has thought extensively about the end of the game. "Do you know why I've been waiting for it?" "Tell me," Harry said. "Because it doesn't work without my participation," she said. "The fourth position of the compact isn't a forced binding. Emrys understood that what I am cannot be compelled the way a human Dark Lord can be compelled. The fourth position requires consent." She looked at Harry steadily. "I can feel the compact's authority. I've felt it since your blood activated the vault. And I know, I've always known, since the first time I encountered the theory of what Emrys and Slytherin were building, that the fourth binding is the only thing in 15 centuries that has offered me something other than continuation." "What does it offer?" Harry asked. "Purpose," she said. "The same thing you offered Tom Riddle. The same thing that brought Grindelwald voluntarily out of his tower." She looked at the compact, and for the first time the absolute stillness broke slightly, something beneath the surface of those dark eyes that was very old and very tired. "I have been accumulating for 400 years, Potter. Continuation without purpose. Power without direction. I have no ideology, no vision, no goal except the next waking, and in every waking the world is less interesting and the accumulation is less satisfying and the next dormancy comes sooner because there is nothing to stay awake for." A pause. "Until the compact activated. Until your name was added. Until I understood what you were actually building." The clock machinery turned around them, slow and inexorable. "The root systems," Harry said. "The power reserve. I'll release it. Willingly. The seedlings in Vinohrady," she glanced at Grindelwald with that almost smile again. "The ones he didn't burn in 1919. I'll release them completely. The power dissipates back into the substrate harmlessly. I've done it before, in the rare moments when continuation seemed less necessary than rest. She looked back at Harry. What I need to know is whether you actually understand what binding me into the compact means. What I bring to the fourth position. 400 years, Harry said. Of watching dark power accumulate, peak, and collapse. Of understanding the cycles from the inside in a way no human Dark Lord ever could, because you've lived multiple cycles. You've watched Riddle and Grindelwald and every name on that list from the outside, and you know things about the patterns of dark power that none of them know. She looked at him with something that had shifted all the way into respect. Yes, she said. And you know what Emrys and Slytherin were most afraid of, because you're the thing they were most afraid of, and you've been thinking about their solution for 400 years. Yes. And you're tired, Harry said. Not in a way that wants to stop. In a way that wants something worth doing. She was still for a long moment. Then she held out her hand. Harry looked at it. The hand of a very old woman in her 50s who was not a woman. He looked at Grindelwald, who gave him the smallest nod. He looked at Riddle, who was watching with those sharp dark eyes, and whose expression, and this was the thing that settled it, because Riddle's judgment about dark things was not something Harry discounted, held no alarm. He opened the compact to page 4. Your name, he said. Voluntarily. Voluntarily, she said. He held the book between them. She placed her hand on the page. The blood bond mechanism of the compact did what it had done twice before, but this time it was different in quality, the way the third movement of a symphony is different from the first two. The lines spread outward from the page, and the brass machinery of the clock caught them and reflected them, and the whole tower was briefly and entirely and silently full of light. Then it was gone. The compact was warm against Harry's hands in a way it hadn't been before, not the warmth of a living thing, but the warmth of a system complete. For names on page 4, and all 4 bound, and the network between them singing at a frequency Harry could feel in his chest. Through that network, he felt Neville. Felt the 3 root sites go quiet, one by one, as 100 years of accumulated power released itself gently back into the prog substrate like an exhaled breath. Felt the deep pulse under the city change quality, not absent, just clear. Uncomplicated. Old stones being old stones again. Malakova stood in the clock chamber with her hands still touching the compact and her eyes closed, and the expression on her face was something Harry had no word for. Not relief. Not joy. Something older and quieter than both, that he recognized nonetheless. Grindelwald was watching her with that same careful seriousness he'd shown in his cell when Harry had said Dumbledore's name. Better, he said. Just the one word. She opened her eyes. Different, she said. I haven't been bound to anything since, she paused. I genuinely don't know. I've been only myself for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be part of a structure. She looked at Harry. You should know that the 4-way binding has changed your relationship to the compact substantially. I know. Page 11. Not just page 11. The entire architecture. You're not holding 3 bound lords and 1 entity now. You're the center of something with 4 points, and the combined knowledge base that represents is, she searched for a word. Unprecedented, Riddle said, from behind Harry, in the same tone he'd used in the library 2 weeks ago. Flat assessment, no embellishment. Yes, she said. Harry's communicating charm flared warm against his wrist, Hermione's signal that meant everything is fine down here, what's happening up there, I am very anxious, please respond. He sent back the one pulse that meant good, coming down. The clock, Malakova said, looking at the machinery around them with an expression that had changed entirely from when they'd first walked in. I've always liked this clock. I like things that keep going. So do I, Harry said. He went down the stairs with Riddle and Grindelwald, the compact full and warm inside his jacket, and the morning was waiting at the bottom, grey prog light and cold air and cobblestones. Hermione was at the base of the tower. She looked at his face first, then at Grindelwald and Riddle, then at the woman coming down the stairs behind them. She processed this in approximately 2 seconds and said, "She agreed. She agreed. Voluntarily. Voluntarily." Hermione looked at Malakova with the particular look she had when she was seeing something she needed to fully understand before she could properly respond to it. Malakova looked back with a slight tilt of the head that was, somehow, not unfriendly. "You're the one who built the containment model," Malakova said. "Yes," Hermione said. "It was well constructed. It would have worked, in the scenario it was built for." A pause. "That scenario didn't obtain." "I'm aware," Hermione said dryly. "I'll revise it. I can help you understand what it needed to account for. I know what I look like from the outside in full emergence, because I've read accounts." Something crossed her face that was, improbably, almost wry. "They're dramatic." "I imagine so," Hermione said. She fell into step beside her as they moved away from the tower, already apparently composing questions. Harry watched them go with the familiar feeling of watching Hermione turn a new and complex thing into something she could hold and examine. Neville appeared from a side street with Novotna, both of them with soil on their hands in the way of two people who had been doing serious work in a hurry. He looked at Harry. Harry lifted the compact slightly. Neville looked at it, then at the woman walking with Hermione, then back at Harry. "All 4, he said. "All 4. Neville nodded slowly. "Then, the root systems are clear. All 3 sites." Novotna had access to some truly impressive underground passages. "Actually, I've never seen 14th century foundation work up close. Extraordinary stonework." Novotna, who was apparently close enough to hear this, said, "I have been trying to interest people in those foundations for 30 years. "I'm genuinely interested," Neville said earnestly. She looked at him sideways. "Come back in summer. I'll give you a proper tour." "I'd like that," Neville said. Riddle had come to stand beside Harry, looking at the square, at the clock face on the tower, at the pigeons, at the morning going about its business. "Well," he said, which was possibly the most conversational thing Harry had ever heard him say. "Well," Harry agreed. "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Riddle considered. "Something that just wanted. In the way dark things want. Without the," he paused. "She's tired," Harry said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand that." He said it without particular emphasis, without the careful control he usually applied to personal statements. Just a fact, offered plainly. Harry looked at him. At the young sharp face in the grey prog morning. "I know," he said. They stood there for a moment, the 5 of them in the square, Harry and Riddle and Grindelwald and, a few steps away, Hermione and Malakova already deep in what was clearly going to be a very long conversation, and Neville and Novotna discussing 14th century stonework. The clock above them turned. The mechanisms inside it, which had been turning for 600 years, continued to turn. The compact inside Harry's jacket was warm and complete, and the network between 4 bound names ran through it like current through a live wire, present, active, waiting to be useful. Grindelwald appeared at Harry's shoulder, his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the clock tower with the expression of a man looking at something he'd been part of, in one way or another, for 70 years. "What happens now?" he said. "Now we go back," Harry said. "We have work to do. The 4th binding changes the scope considerably." "Yes." Malakova's knowledge base alone, Grindelwald shook his head slightly. "What we can build with all 4 in concert. The theoretical possibilities are significant," Harry said. "I was going to say staggering," Grindelwald said dryly, "but I see you're practicing understatement. I learned it from you." Grindelwald looked at him with those asymmetric blue eyes and something in them that was, quite clearly and without disguise, amused. "We'll make something of you yet, Potter." "You'll try," Harry said, and meant it as a compliment, and the old man received it as one. Hermione's voice carried across the square, asking Malakova something technical about power resonance that got an answer in the same register, and it was so completely, perfectly Hermione, finding the most formidable dark entity of the millennium and immediately sitting her down for a proper academic exchange, that Harry felt the laugh come up before he could decide about it. He let it come. The sound of it went across the old grey square and up the cold Prague air, and the pigeons ignored it entirely, and the clock turned, and the city went on being what it was. He pulled out his wand and sent the portkey signal. They had a train of thought to pick up back at Hogwarts, and a framework to build, and something unprecedented to attempt, and the morning was already half gone. He turned away from the tower. "Let's go home," he said. Chapter 5, The Claws. Hermione found 3 weeks after Prague, the working room on the 6th floor had become something else entirely. It had started as a research space, documents, maps, the careful accumulation of information toward a specific problem. That problem was solved, or the immediate version of it was, and what had replaced it was something harder to define. The table was larger now, extended by 2 conjured sections that didn't quite match the original oak. The walls had acquired layers, maps still, but also theoretical frameworks, magical diagrams that Malakova drew in a script none of them could fully read but all of them were beginning to understand, Riddle's coded annotations transferred from documents onto the wall itself in his small precise hand. Hermione's color-coded cross-reference system that had expanded from paper into an entire section of wall that she updated every morning before breakfast. It looked, Harry thought, like the inside of a very ambitious mind. Malakova had integrated into the work with a smoothness that was either natural or the product of 4 centuries of social adaptation, and he suspected both. She had a quality of presence that was different from the others. Where Riddle was contained and Grindelwald was expansive, she was simply there, completely and without apparent effort, in a way that made rooms feel settled. She didn't take up space so much as make space coherent. Hermione had described this after the first week as an incredibly calming magical field, and Malakova had responded that it was a survival mechanism developed approximately in 1650 and had occasionally been inconvenient. The work itself had shifted in scope after the 4th binding, exactly as Grindelwald had said it would. The combined knowledge base was extraordinary, for centuries of dark theory from Malakova, Grindelwald's structural analysis of large-scale magical society, Riddle's precise and comprehensive understanding of dark magic's architecture, and Harry's own experience, which he'd initially dismissed as the least theoretical component until Riddle had told him, with the precision of someone making an accurate assessment rather than a kind one, that his was the most complete practical knowledge base. At the table. "You've survived more direct encounters with dark magical extremity than any living wizard," Riddle had said. "That is not a small dataset." "It mostly involved not dying," Harry said. "How you didn't die is the interesting part. They were building something. That was the constant." The specifics of what they were building had been, in these 3 weeks, a matter of ongoing discussion and occasional genuine argument, but the outline was becoming clear, a new institutional framework for the magical world that was neither the Ministry's bureaucratic opacity nor the ICW's unwieldy international committee structure, but something that used the Compact's authority as a foundation while building legitimate governance on top of it. Something that would outlast Harry himself and the extraordinary accident of his bloodline. The arguments about this were the most interesting part of Harry's days. Grindelwald argued from the standpoint of someone who had once tried to build something similar and had the specific knowledge of every mistake he'd made. His contributions to the institutional design were precise and often uncomfortable. He kept pointing out the exact mechanisms by which good intentions became authoritarian structures, because he had built those mechanisms himself and knew them intimately. Malakova argued from the longer view. For centuries of watching human institutions rise and collapse gave her a perspective on structural durability that nobody else at the table had, and she used it without nostalgia and without cynicism, which was its own kind of remarkable. Riddle argued from pure theory. The framework of how power operated, how authority legitimized itself, how the relationship between exceptional ability and institutional function had worked and failed across magical history. It was the most rigorous thinking Harry had encountered, and the most frustrating, because Riddle was entirely capable of identifying the correct answer through pure analysis and entirely uninterested in the emotional dimension of whether people would accept it. The emotional dimension is not separate from the structural question, Hermione had told him, on day 11, with the firmness of someone who had been making this point repeatedly and was going to keep making it until it landed. Human institutions exist because humans inhabit them. If the design doesn't account for how people actually feel and think and respond to authority, it fails. Not theoretically. Actually. Riddle had looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd picked up his pen and added something to his section of the wall, which when Harry looked at it later turned out to be, emotional architecture, consult H. That had been, in Harry's estimation, a significant moment. Neville was in and out. He'd stayed for the first week after Prague, contributed substantially to the botanical sections of the knowledge base, and then gone back to his herbology apprenticeship with Professor Sprout because he had responsibilities and because, as he'd told Harry with characteristic directness, the big thinking is your lot. I'm better at the actual ground-level work. Tell me what you need done and I'll do it. Harry had told him what he needed, and Neville had gone and done it, 3 separate trips in 3 weeks, to locations Malakova had identified as sites of historical dark activity where the magical substrate had been damaged, where Neville's specific expertise in magical botanical restoration was making the kind of difference that didn't show up in theoretical frameworks but was nevertheless the most concrete and immediate good anyone in the project had yet produced. It was Hermione who found the clause. She'd been working through the compact's later pages for 2 weeks, building a complete legal analysis of its structural provisions, because if they were going to use the compact as a foundation for institutional design they needed to understand every element of what it actually said and required. Harry had read the whole thing on the first night, but he'd read it fast and under pressure, and Hermione reading something was a fundamentally different process from Harry reading the same thing. She found it on a Tuesday morning. Harry knew something had happened before she said anything because of the quality of her stillness. Hermione in full intellectual engagement was never still. She moved, wrote, cross-referenced, made sounds of varying significance. When she went completely still it meant something had stopped her, and things that stopped Hermione Granger were worth paying close attention to. She was at the far end of the table with the compact open in front of her, and she'd gone still in the way of someone who has read a sentence and is reading it again and would quite like it to say something different the second time. "Harry," she said. The quality of that one word brought his head up immediately. "What?" She looked at him. She looked at the compact. She looked at him again, with the expression she wore when she was deciding how to say something difficult. "Come and read page 23, she said. He crossed the room. He read page 23. Page 23 was in the same ancient hand as the rest of the compact, the script archaic but legible, and it contained what appeared to be a sunset provision, a clause governing the termination or dissolution of the compact's authority structure. He read it once quickly, and then again slowly, and then a third time because he wanted to be sure he was understanding the Latin correctly. He was. "That's the clause," he said. "That's the clause," Hermione said. "I missed it on the first read. It's deliberately placed at the back. And the script is smaller here than in the rest of the document." She pointed at the relevant section. "Read the 3rd paragraph." He read the 3rd paragraph. The 3rd paragraph of page 23 stated, in the precise legal Latin of Merlin's era, that the compact's authority over its bound lords was not permanent. It was conditional. The binding held as long as the compact's stated purpose, the prevention of cyclical dark catastrophe and the building of a framework for sustainable magical governance, was being actively pursued. If the compact's holder ceased to pursue that purpose, or if the purpose was declared complete by unanimous accord of all bound parties, the authority structure dissolved. The bound lords would retain their connection to the compact's knowledge base but the compelled obedience would end. Which meant that Harry's authority over 4 of the most powerful dark wizards and entities in history was not a permanent state. It was a working relationship with a termination clause. He straightened up. "Why does this feel like it changes things?" "Because it does change things," Hermione said. Fundamentally. Harry, the compact isn't designed to be a permanent authority structure. It's designed to be a scaffold. You build the thing, and then the scaffold comes down, and the thing either stands or it doesn't. Harry looked at the page for a moment longer. Then he looked around the room, at Malakova at the far end, who had gone very still in a different way from Hermione's stillness, more like deep water going still, at Grindelwald, who had his pen down and was looking at the table, at Riddle, who was looking at Harry with an expression that was completely unreadable. "How long have they known?" he asked quietly. "The sunset provision is on page 23, Hermione said. "They've all read the full text by now." Harry looked at each of them in turn. Malakova. Grindelwald. Riddle. "When?" he said. Grindelwald spoke first. "I identified it on day 4, he said. "After you gave me full access to the text." "Day 2, Riddle said. His voice was level. "The Latin construction of the third paragraph is distinctive. I recognized the legal form immediately." He looked at Malakova. "I have known about the sunset provision since Emrys was still alive," she said simply. "He discussed it with me once, briefly, in an encounter that neither of us was prepared for. He was very young. He told me that what he was building was not a cage but a commission, his word. He was trying, I think, to reassure me. But I wasn't afraid of being caged. I was afraid of being irrelevant." She looked at her hands. "The sunset provision meant that I had a reason to cooperate fully, because the dissolution wasn't forced. It was earned." Harry sat down. He thought about this for a moment, about the fact that 3 of the 4 bound lords had known, for weeks, that their binding was conditional and potentially temporary, and none of them had tried to use that knowledge as leverage, and none of them had told him. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. Not accusatory. Genuinely asking. It was Riddle who answered. He set his pen down with the precise movement he used when he was being deliberate about something. "Because what you're building doesn't require permanent compulsion to work. I recognized that in the first week." A pause. "The Compact's authority gave this project the structure to begin. But the reason any of us are still here, still working, the reason Grindelwald didn't spend the first 3 days looking for the sunset provision's activation clause so he could trigger it, is not the compulsion." "Then what is it?" Harry said. Riddle looked at him steadily. "You know what it is. I'd like you to say it." A long pause. Riddle looked at the wall, at the accumulated framework of 3 weeks of genuinely productive work, at the theoretical architecture for something that had never existed before. "It's worth doing," he said. "That's what it is. It is simply worth doing, and I have not, in my life, had many opportunities to say that about anything I was part of." He looked back at Harry. "The sunset provision doesn't change that." "It changes the terms," Hermione said, and Harry knew from her tone that she'd been working toward this since she'd found the clause, that this was the real thing she needed to say. "Harry, the sunset provision doesn't just mean the binding can end. It means the binding should end, eventually. That's the design. Merlin wasn't building something eternal. He was building something that does a specific job and then gets out of the way." She leaned forward. "The question it raises isn't whether the authority structure should eventually dissolve. It's what we need to have built before it does. The framework needs to be self-sustaining," Malakova said. "Before the scaffold comes down, the structure underneath it needs to be able to stand. That is the condition." She looked at Harry. "Emrys was very clear about this in the passage I mentioned. The commission, his word, is not complete until the structure is genuinely independent of the Compact's authority." "And the unanimous accord clause," Grindelwald said. "All 5 parties must agree that the purpose is complete before the dissolution activates. It's not something any one party can trigger unilaterally." He looked at Harry. "Including you." Harry absorbed this. "So I can't simply decide we're done and release you." "No. And we cannot simply declare it done to escape the binding. The accord must be genuine, the compact's architecture would detect a false consensus. Grindelwald's mouth curved slightly. Emery's was very thorough about closing loopholes. He had a lot of practice, Malakova said dryly. He'd been closing my loopholes for 20 years before he built the compact. So what does it mean practically? Harry asked. He looked at Hermione. You've had this for what, 3 hours? You've been thinking about it since you found it. What does it mean for what we're building? Hermione reached across the table and picked up a fresh parchment. It means we need to accelerate, she said. We've been building the theoretical framework at the pace of good research, careful, thorough, properly verified. That's right, and I'm not suggesting we sacrifice quality. But the sunset provision means we have a design requirement we haven't been explicitly accounting for. The framework doesn't just need to work. It needs to work without us. She wrote something at the top of the parchment and turned it so Harry could see, independence criteria. Every element we design needs to be evaluated against this question: does this require the compact's authority to function, or does it stand on its own? Most of it requires the compact's authority currently, Riddle said. Currently, Hermione agreed. That's the word. We need transition mechanisms. Ways to shift the authority from the compact's binding to something the institutional framework generates internally. She looked at Harry. The knowledge base is the easiest part. All of the research, all of the theoretical work, that transfers to the new institution regardless of whether the compact is active. The hard part is the legitimacy. The world knows about the compact, Grindelwald said. Or is beginning to. The ICW's response to Prague was, he searched for a word. Alarmed, Harry supplied. Alarmed, yes, and also fascinated and also, in several quarters, extremely interested. He picked up his pen. The international magical community's response to what we've been doing here has not been uniformly hostile. There are people, significant people, in significant positions, who have been waiting for precisely this kind of institutional reimagining. This was true and Harry knew it. In the 3 weeks since Prague, he'd received 37 pieces of correspondence from magical governments, independent scholars, magical civil society organizations, and several individuals who had described themselves, in varying terms, as having been waiting for something like this without knowing exactly what they were waiting for. He'd answered most of them. He'd met with 6 of them in person, here, at Hogwarts, in the working room, with Riddle and Grindelwald and Malakova present and the compact visible on the table. Those meetings had been extraordinary. Watching people encounter the reality of what the room contained, the assembled knowledge, the unexpected cooperation, the genuine quality of what was being built, and seeing their expressions shift from cautious skepticism to something more like recognition. The legitimacy problem, Harry said. Let's stay on that. What does a self-sustaining institutional authority look like, in specific terms? What followed was 4 hours of the most rigorous conversation Harry had ever participated in, and he'd been having rigorous conversations for 3 weeks straight. Hermione drove it from the independence criteria framework she'd sketched out. Malakova provided the long view, what had made magical institutions durable across centuries, what had made them collapse, the specific patterns of failure that repeated with enough consistency to be considered structural rather than circumstantial. Riddle built the formal architecture of authority transfer, working through it with the systematic precision that was his specific genius, identifying the exact mechanisms by which the compact's legitimacy could be absorbed into institutional legitimacy rather than simply withdrawn. Grindelwald did something different. He'd been quiet for the first hour, which was unusual enough that Harry noticed it. Not absent, he was tracking everything, his eyes moving between speakers and the wall and the documents with their characteristic quick intelligence. But not contributing, which was unlike him. When he finally spoke, it was into a gap between Riddle's formal analysis and Hermione's practical pushback, and what he said changed the temperature of the room. You're all designing an institution, he said. I've designed an institution. I know what the failure mode looks like from the inside. He set his pen down. The failure mode is not structural inadequacy. The framework Tom is building is sound, and Hermione's independence criteria are correct. The failure mode is that an institution built around exceptional individuals becomes exceptional only while those individuals are present. Which is the point of the independence criteria, Hermione said. Partially. But the independence criteria address the functional question, will the institution work without us? The question they don't address is the human one, will people trust it? He looked at Harry. I spent 20 years building a movement. It was organized, it was principled in its own way, it attracted genuinely capable people who believed in it. And when Albus defeated me it collapsed in 5 years. Not because the institutional structure was inadequate. Because the movement was built around my authority, and when my authority ended, people discovered they hadn't been trusting the institution. They'd been trusting me. The room was quiet. The new framework has to be trusted in itself, Grindelwald continued. Not trusted because Harry holds the compact, not trusted because Tom and I are part of it. Trusted because of what it does and how it does it and what it stands for independently of all of us. He looked at Hermione's independence criteria on the parchment. Add a column. Not just does this function without the compact, but does this earn trust without the compact? Those are different questions. Hermione looked at the parchment for a moment. Then she added the column. How? Harry said. Not rhetorical. In specific terms. How does an institution earn trust? Transparency, Hermione said immediately. Accountability structures. Genuine consequences for failure. Representation, Malakova said. The people it governs have to have a meaningful voice in it. Not ceremonially. Actually. Track record, Riddle said. Trust is built through consistent behavior over time. It cannot be constructed in advance. It has to be accumulated. He paused. Which means the framework needs to be operational before the compact's authority dissolves. People need to see it working first. And it needs to do something tangible, Harry said. Not just govern. Something that people can point at and say, that happened, and it was good, and the institution was responsible for it. The Prague problem, Grindelwald said. The substrate damage across Europe from centuries of dark activity. The magical environmental damage that nobody has been taking responsibility for because no institution has had the authority or the knowledge base to address it. Harry looked at him. That's what Neville is already doing, Grindelwald said. 3 restoration sites in 3 weeks. Preliminary work, but visible and verifiable. The magical communities near those sites have already noticed the difference. He gestured at the wall. We have Malakova's 4 centuries of knowledge about where the damage is most severe. We have the botanical expertise. We have the theoretical framework for large-scale substrate restoration that none of the existing institutions have. That is something tangible. That is something the new institution can do, visibly and well, before the compact's authority ever becomes relevant to the question of whether it should be trusted. Harry looked around the table. At the accumulated work on the walls and the table. At 4 people who had spent their lives, some of those lives very long lives, some of those lives very complicated ones, working against the world in various ways and were now, for the first time, working in a direction that had a chance of lasting beyond them. The clause Hermione found, he said. It's not a threat. It's a deadline. Yes, Hermione said. And the deadline is, when we're ready, Malakova said. That's the only honest answer. When what we've built can stand without the scaffold. That could be months. It could be years. What does it look like when we're ready? Harry asked. Concretely. What does the institution look like on the day we invoke the unanimous accord? And this question, was the thing that carried them through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, through the dinner trays the house elves brought and mostly left cold, through the point where the sky outside the tall windows went dark and someone lit the candles without anyone paying attention to who it was. The question of what they were building, not in abstract terms but in the detailed, specific, argued over and revised terms of actual design. The institution needed a name first, and that took 45 minutes of argument that ended with Hermione writing the compact authority for magical governance on the wall and everyone accepting it without enthusiasm as the best available option, which was, Riddle noted, how most institutional names were chosen. It needed a governing council with representation from every major magical community, and the structure of that council took an hour. It needed a charter that codified the principles the work had been built on, and the principles were harder than the charter, because principles that sounded simple in conversation became complex when you tried to write them in language that couldn't be misread, and Riddle and Grindelwald disagreed about legal language with the focused intensity of two people who had spent their lives writing documents that compelled behavior and understood exactly why precision mattered. It needed an enforcement mechanism that wasn't a compact, something institutional, with checks, with oversight, with the specific limitations that made power trustworthy rather than merely powerful. This was Hermione's domain and she held it with absolute authority, citing the entirety of magical legal history and several Muggle political frameworks that she'd apparently been reading in preparation for this exact conversation and that Malakova found genuinely interesting and wanted to discuss at length and that Riddle engaged with reluctantly and then with increasing intellectual honesty. And it needed, Harry said, somewhere around 9 in the evening, the one thing that nobody had yet put explicitly on the list. It needs someone to lead it, he said. The room looked at him. Not me, he said. The whole point of the independence criteria is that it doesn't run on my authority. I'm 17 years old and I held the compact long enough to build this, I'm not the person who runs it for the next 50 years. Who then? Hermione asked. Harry looked at Grindelwald. Grindelwald looked back at him with those asymmetric blue eyes, and something moved through his face that was several things at once, recognition, surprise that he was surprised, and underneath those, something that was not yet quite willingness but was the shape willingness would grow into. You're serious, Grindelwald said. You built a movement from scratch that organized a continent, Harry said. You know every way that kind of thing fails. You've spent 30 years thinking about what you should have built instead. You're the only person at this table who has both the institutional knowledge and the specific education in failure that something like this requires. He paused. And you're not going to live forever, which means the transition question is built in, you have a finite term, and you know it, and that means you have to build the succession into the design from the beginning. Grindelwald was quiet for a long moment. You're asking the man who built the last century's worst magical authoritarian regime to lead the replacement, he said. I'm asking the man who spent 30 years understanding exactly why it failed and what should exist instead, Harry said. Those aren't the same person. They live in the same body. I know. That's not disqualifying. That's the qualification. Harry held his gaze. Grindelwald. Who better than someone who genuinely knows what not to do, and genuinely cares about getting it right this time, and has the specific combination of vision and hard-won humility that this is going to need? The silence stretched. I have conditions, Grindelwald said. Tell me. A formal public accounting. Before I take any institutional role. Everything I did, documented and presented to the communities I harmed. No rehabilitation narrative, no softening. The record stands in full and the institution I lead carries that record as part of its founding context. He said it with the absolute steadiness of someone who has made a decision they've been approaching for a long time. The trust has to be built on honesty, not on managed history. Yes, Harry said. And I want Tom on the governing council. Riddle looked up sharply. He's the foremost theoretical mind on dark magical architecture in the world, Grindelwald said to Riddle, with the direct simplicity of a man making an accurate statement and not particularly interested in whether it landed well. We disagree on method. We agree on most of the foundational questions. The council needs his specific knowledge, and it needs someone who will push back on my instincts toward grand gesture. A slight pause. I was better when someone pushed back on me. I made terrible decisions when no one could. Riddle looked at him for a long moment. Under what title? he said, which was, Harry recognized, Tom Riddle asking a practical question instead of answering an emotional one, which was itself a form of yes. Whatever title you'd accept, Grindelwald said. Hermione, who had been writing throughout this exchange, said, Director of Theoretical Foundations. It's accurate and it has no prior associations. Fine, Riddle said. Fine, Grindelwald agreed. Malakova had been watching all of this with the expression she wore when she was seeing patterns across time. And my role, she said to Harry. What do you want? Harry said. She considered. It was a genuine consideration, not performance, not strategy. I want to do what I've been doing here, she said. The long view analysis. The pattern recognition. I am not an administrator and I am not a theorist in the formal sense. What I am is a record, a living record of 4 centuries of what dark power does to the world and what the world does with dark power. That is useful. She looked at the walls, at the accumulated work, at the maps of substrate damage, at the theoretical frameworks. I want to be useful. Continuously. Not periodically called upon as a curiosity. Then you have a permanent seat on the council, Harry said. Permanent. Not renewable, not conditional. Yours. She looked at him. The dark eyes that were very old and had seen many things. You're not afraid of what that means. A permanent seat for something that doesn't age, that has 400 years of its own history with dark power. Should I be? Many people would be. Many people haven't read the Compact, Harry said. Page 7. Emrys wrote about you specifically. He said that the thing most people misunderstand about power is that duration doesn't corrupt it, the absence of purpose does. You had power without purpose for 400 years. You have purpose now. He held her gaze. I trust that. She was still for a moment. Then, Emrys was a remarkably perceptive young man. I know, Harry said. I've got his blood. The working room was warm and late and full of the specific comfortable exhaustion of people who have done something real. The candles had burned down past their midpoints. Outside the tall windows, the Hogwarts grounds were dark and quiet and the lake was flat and still. Hermione set her quill down, looked at the parchment in front of her, and said, It's enough. Not complete, there's months of detailed work still. But the framework is here. The bones of it. She looked around the room. This is what needs to be built before the sunset provision activates. And I think, she paused, and her voice did something it rarely did, something that was not analytical but purely human, I think it can actually work. Not because of the Compact. Because of this. She gestured at the room. Because of everyone in this room doing what they've been doing for 3 weeks. Nobody argued with that. Harry picked up the Compact. He looked at the 4 names on page 4, all of them clear, all of them stable, the 4th name as solid and present as the others now, nothing shifting in it except the deep warm hum of the network running between them. He thought about Merlin and Slytherin, who had built this thing in a vault beneath a school and had waited 15 centuries for the right bloodline to activate it. He thought about what they'd been afraid of and what they'd tried to build against that fear. He thought about 2 men who were apparently friends and who had apparently made, according to the Compact's first page, rather a lot of mistakes. He thought that they'd probably be satisfied. Not because it was perfect. Because it was honest, and it was working, and the people around this table were genuinely trying to build something good, and that specific and unglamorous and irreplaceable fact, was what 15 centuries of careful architecture had been waiting for. Tomorrow, he said. We start the detailed design. Hermione's independence criteria, Grindelwald's trust column, Tom's authority transfer mechanisms. All of it. Tomorrow, Hermione said. Tomorrow, said Riddle, and Grindelwald, and Malakova. Harry set the Compact on the table. It sat there in the candlelight, warm and full and 4-pointed, and the room held it, and the night was quiet around the castle, and something that had been waiting for a very long time was, at last, beginning to be built. Chapter 6, The Architecture of Kings. 6 months after Prague, on a morning in late April when the Hogwarts grounds were doing their annual aggressive impression of somewhere worth being, Harry Potter stood in front of 243 people and told them the truth. The truth was complicated, so he'd taken some time to think about how to say it simply. He tried 3 drafts with Hermione, who had improved all of them, and then told him to throw out the drafts and just speak, because he was better unrehearsed and they both knew it. He'd had a conversation with Riddle the night before that had gone on until 2 in the morning and had been, technically, about the speech but had really been about something else, about what it meant to stand in front of people with real authority and choose to account for it honestly, which was something Riddle had spent 40 years avoiding and was still learning to respect in theory even as he was building it into the institution's design. The Assembly Hall of the new Compact Authority for Magical Governance had been built, in a feat of coordinated magical construction that Malakova had supervised with the particular focus of someone who had watched a lot of buildings go up badly, in the center of what had been a derelict magical quarter of Vienna. The city was the ICW's nominal seat and had the advantage of being on the European continent without belonging specifically to any single national magical culture. The hall itself was large and lit by windows that ran from floor to ceiling on 3 sides, and it had no dais, no elevated platform from which the leadership looked down at the assembled, because Hermione had made this a design requirement in the 4th week and nobody had successfully argued her out of it. The 243 people in the room represented 41 magical communities across 5 continents. Some were government officials. Some were scholars. Some were civil society representatives who'd been doing the actual work of magical governance at community level for decades without any formal institutional recognition. Some were people Harry had written to personally, having found their names through the network of correspondence that had been building since Prague, having read their work or heard about what they'd done, having decided that this thing he was building needed specific minds and specific voices that the obvious channels wouldn't have produced. Neville was there. He was sitting in the 3rd row with soil that Harry was fairly certain was not entirely from this morning under his fingernails, because he'd been doing restoration work in the Vienna substrate for the past week and was constitutionally incapable of not being in the ground when there was useful work to do. He caught Harry's eye and gave him the small nod he'd been giving him since first year, the one that meant you're going to be fine, get on with it. Harry got on with it. The Compact of Merlin and Slytherin was built in the 6th century by 2 men who were afraid, he said. I think that's the right place to start. Not with what they built, but with why, because the why is the whole thing. He told them. Not the shortened version, not the diplomatically managed version that the ICW's communications office had been constructing for 3 months and that Harry had been politely refusing to adopt as his official account. The actual version. Malakova's 4 centuries, and what she represented, the accumulation of dark power without purpose that was the thing Emrys and Slytherin had most feared. Grindelwald's 30 years in a tower thinking about everything he'd done wrong, and what had come out of that thinking. Tom Riddle, reconstituted by the Compact in a body that was 20 years old and a mind that was finally, genuinely, turned in a useful direction. He watched people's faces as he told it. The range of reactions moved from skepticism through discomfort through something that, on the faces of the people he'd most hoped to reach, settled into the specific quality of someone hearing an honest account of something difficult and recognizing its honesty. He talked for 40 minutes. He didn't use notes. When he finished, the hall was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of an audience that doesn't know how to respond, the fuller quiet of people who were processing something that required processing. Then a woman in the 2nd row, a senior representative of the West African Magical Congress, formidable and precise, who had been one of the 6 people Harry had met with in the Hogwarts working room 4 months ago, raised her hand and said, "Where is Grindelwald?" "At the back of the room," Harry said. She turned. Most of the room turned. Grindelwald was standing against the back wall with his hands in his coat pockets, 86 years old and completely comfortable with being looked at by 243 people in the way that people who have spent their lives commanding attention are comfortable with it. "You intend to give him institutional authority," she said. It was not a question. "With full public accounting of his record," Harry said. "The documentation is in the folders your delegation received." Every action, every decision, every consequence, documented by the historical record and by Grindelwald's own written account, which he produced voluntarily over the course of 4 months and which did not omit anything. He looked at Grindelwald, who met his gaze from the back of the room with the absolute steadiness of a man who had spent 6 months doing the hardest thing he'd ever done and wasn't going to look away from it now. "The trust question is yours," Harry said, to the room. "I'm not asking you to trust Grindelwald because I do. I'm asking you to read what he's written and what the record contains and make your own judgment. The institution's founding charter requires that leadership is accountable to the governing council, not the other way around. What Grindelwald did with authority when it was accountable to nothing is documented. What he does with it now, under a framework built specifically to prevent the failure modes he knows from the inside, that is the question. And that question can only be answered over time." The woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the front. "Continue," she said. He continued. The practical architecture of the institution took another 90 minutes to present, which Hermione delivered in precise and exhaustive detail with the visual aids she'd spent 3 weeks preparing and which were, Harry thought, the clearest institutional design presentation he'd ever seen, which admittedly was not a very large category but felt significant anyway. The governing council structure. The charter provisions. The authority transfer mechanisms. The independence criteria checklist, complete with verification protocols. The enforcement framework. And the sunset provision. Hermione put that up last, on its own, with no surrounding context or supporting material. Just the text, translated into modern English, projected on the wall for the full room to read. "The authority of the compact over its bound parties is conditional and terminable," she said. "This is not a feature that was hidden from us or that we discovered inconveniently. It is the design. The institution we are building is designed to make itself independent of the compact's authority, and when it succeeds in doing so, the scaffold comes down and the structure stands on its own or doesn't." She looked at the room. "We are telling you this now, on the founding day, because an institution built on transparency cannot have its foundational document be something its membership doesn't know about. You deserve to know what this is and what it isn't." The discussion that followed was substantial, and occasionally heated, and was exactly the kind of discussion Harry had wanted to have because it was the kind that could only happen between people who were taking something seriously. He sat on the edge of a table, there was no podium, no chair of authority, and participated in it as one voice among many, which was precisely what the design required. At one point a young wizard from the Eastern European Magical Assembly, perhaps 25, with the intensity of someone who had been waiting a long time to say something to someone in authority, stood up and said, "What's to stop you from simply deciding the purpose is complete whenever you want and releasing yourself from the compact's obligations?" Harry looked at him. The unanimous accord provision requires all 5 parties to agree that the purpose is genuinely complete. I can't declare it done unilaterally. And the other 4 parties have every reason to be rigorous about that judgment, because if the institution isn't truly independent when the binding dissolves, they're the ones who are immediately free of the compact's authority with no institutional framework holding the accountability structure in place. He paused. But more than that, the compact detects false consensus. You can't perform agreement to trigger the provision. It has to be real. And if you wanted to abuse your authority before that point, the young wizard pressed. "Then the governing council can override me," Hermione said, from where she was standing by the projections. Article 7 of the Charter. Any action by the compact's holder that a 2/3 council majority determines is contrary to the institution's founding purpose is null. And the holder can be removed from active authority by the same majority, leaving the compact's binding in effect but its holder's directive power suspended pending review. She looked at the young wizard levelly. "We built that clause in week 2. It was Harry's suggestion." The young wizard sat down. He was still intense but the intensity had changed character, it was the intensity of someone who'd been looking for the catch and was now looking at what was actually there. The assembly ran until late afternoon. By the time it ended, 41 delegations had signed the founding charter. Harry had expected 30 at best. The woman from the West African Magical Congress had been the first to sign, which had mattered because she was the most credible skeptic in the room and her signature had done more for the institution's legitimacy in the first 5 minutes than anything the preceding 6 months of preparation had produced. Grindelwald had watched the signing from the side of the room. He was signing nothing today. His formal appointment as Director General was pending the public accounting process, which was genuinely public and genuinely rigorous and was going to take another 3 months. He'd known this and had designed it himself, which Harry thought was possibly the single most significant act of the whole project. A man who had spent his life building his own authority, voluntarily designing the process by which that authority would be earned rather than assumed. Harry found him after the assembly had dispersed, standing at one of the tall windows looking at the Vienna rooftops. 41, Harry said. I expected 28, Grindelwald said. So did I. The old man looked at the city for a moment. He had the expression Harry had come to associate with him in recent months, the one that was neither the prison cell version nor the historical photograph version, but something that had grown between those two things over the course of this particular winter and spring. Something that was genuinely present. Albus would have thought it was worth trying, Grindelwald said, quietly, to the window. Harry said nothing. He stood beside him and let the silence be what it was. He would have had 17 objections to the structural design, Grindelwald continued, and the dryness was there but underneath it was warmth, the real kind. He would have wanted more poetry in the charter. He always thought legal language should have more poetry in it. A pause. He would have been here today if he could have been. I know, Harry said. Do you think he knew? About the compact. About what was possible. Harry thought about this. About the portrait in McGonagall's office that he'd spoken to in January, briefly, carefully. The portrait had been characteristically elliptical, had talked around things more than through them, had smiled in that way. I think he suspected, Harry said. I think he knew about both bloodlines, mine and my mum's. I think he put pieces in place that might lead toward the vault if the right person was walking those corridors at the right time. He trusted the castle to do the showing, Grindelwald said. Yes. That's very like him. A long pause. He trusted the right things. That was always his gift. Not strategy, not power, though he had both. He trusted the right things and it usually worked out. Harry looked at him. It worked out, he said. Grindelwald looked back at him then, really looked, the way he did when he was setting aside technique entirely. Yes, he said. It did. The signing dinner was in the assembly hall, tables brought in, the formal atmosphere replaced by something more alive. Harry spent most of it moving between delegations, not working the room in the political sense, just being present, listening, answering questions that needed answering. The representative from the South Asian Confederation wanted to discuss the substrate restoration program, which had expanded from Neville's initial 3 sites to 19 active locations across 8 countries and was the institution's most immediately visible and tangible work. The head of the Nordic Magical Council wanted to discuss the Charter's enforcement provisions in detail. A scholar from the Cairo Institute had questions about Malikova's role that Harry answered honestly and that led to a 40-minute conversation he hadn't planned and hadn't wanted to end. Neville was at a table in the corner with 4 people Harry hadn't met, all of them leaning over what appeared to be restoration site maps, all of them gesturing with the enthusiasm of people who had found other people who cared about the same specific things they cared about. Neville had, in 6 months, assembled what was functionally a small international network of magical botanical restoration specialists, most of them people who'd been doing the work in isolation without institutional support. The Compact Authority's restoration program had given them structure and resources and each other, and what had come out of that was moving faster than anyone had projected. Harry watched him for a moment. The quiet powerful fact of Neville Longbottom, who had not been born to any bloodline of destiny, who had not had any mystical compact fall into his hands, who had simply decided what mattered and had consistently, persistently, and without drama shown up for it. He thought about what Riddle had said about Voldemort. I told him he'd spend his whole career being defeated by people who loved something. Standing here, Watching Neville gesture with a pen over a restoration map, Harry thought that this was what that looked like from the inside. Not heroism, not destiny. Just love. The persistent, practical kind. He found Riddle at the edge of the room, which was where Riddle tended to position himself at social functions, not outside the room, which would have been withdrawal, but not in its center, which would have been performance. The edge, where he could see everything. "Tom," Harry said. Riddle looked at him. 41 signatures, he said. "Yes." The Eastern European Assembly representative, the young one, who asked about abuse of authority, he signed. He did. "Good question," Riddle said. "I thought so." The enforcement provisions in Article 7 were underexplained. The charter language is clear, but people who haven't read it carefully will underestimate the scope of the council override. "That's what the implementation workshops are for," Harry said. "Month 2. I know. I'm leading 3 of them." He said this with the tone of someone who had agreed to something and was not second-guessing it but was noting it. 3 months ago, Riddle leading workshops on institutional governance would have been a sentence that didn't quite parse. Now it was a scheduled item. "How is it?" Harry asked. "Being here. Today specifically." Riddle looked at the room, at the delegations, at the charter on the table, at the visible fact of something built and standing. "Strange," he said. "Not unpleasant." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been in rooms full of people afraid of me. I've been in rooms full of people worshipping me. I've never been in a room full of people who simply need what I know." "How is that?" "Better," he said. Simple, direct, the word chosen carefully. "Significantly better." Harry nodded. "The Director of Theoretical Foundation's appointment goes to the Council in month 3. I know the schedule. You're ready." Riddle looked at him with the dark sharp eyes that had looked at Harry across every kind of darkness for most of both their lives. "Yes," he said. Not confidently, not with the old performance of confidence. Just yes, which was the kind of yes that had earned its right to be simple. "Good," Harry said. Malikova appeared beside him with the quality she had of having always been there, not arriving so much as manifesting from stillness. She was holding a glass of something and looking at the room with her long-view expression, the one that was seeing the present moment and several centuries' worth of context simultaneously. "You look like someone who is doing the accounting," Harry said. "I am always doing the accounting," she said. "It is one of the privileges of age." She looked at him. "You should know, the compact is different tonight." He could feel it. Had felt it since the assembly, actually. A shift in the quality of the network, something that had moved from the working hum of an active project to something that had more resonance to it, more weight. Like a chord that had been almost right for months had finally resolved. "Is it the signatures?" he asked. "It's the institution," she said. "The compact's architecture recognizes when the purpose is being genuinely served. Tonight is the first night that this is true in a way that goes beyond the working room." She looked at the signed charter on the table. Emery's would say the scaffold is load-bearing now. How long until it can stand alone? She considered. A year. Perhaps 2. The substrate restoration program needs to mature, another 12 sites completed, the network Neville is building needs to be formalized. The governance structures need a full annual cycle before anyone can evaluate whether they're genuinely functional. And Grindelwald's accountability process, she paused. 3 months, Harry said. 3 months of process. Then a year of demonstrated leadership. Then, perhaps, the question of the sunset provision becomes real rather than theoretical. She looked at him. "You're not afraid of that?" "No. Most people who hold power, I know," Harry said. "But I never wanted it. I want this." He gestured, at the room, at the charter, at the whole complicated edifice. "The specific thing that's here tonight. And when this is genuinely self-sustaining, I want to be able to walk away from the authority and have the thing continue. He paused. What I want after that is considerably less determined. You're 17, she said, with the particular dryness of someone who has watched 17-year-olds for 400 years. Nearly 18. You have time to be undetermined. I know. He looked at the room. What did you want, at 17? If that's a question that makes sense to ask. She was quiet for a moment. I was not 17 in the way you mean, she said. The first cycle, the first, inception, was not a conscious choice. I was something that grew rather than something that decided. She looked at her hands. But the first time I was conscious enough of myself to want something, I think I wanted to understand. Why it was this way. Why power accumulated and what it did. What the pattern meant. She looked at him. 400 years later, I understand it. And the understanding is exactly as satisfying and exactly as insufficient as all understanding is. A slight pause. But here, what's here tonight, is something I didn't know to want, because I didn't know it was possible. Something built on understanding rather than power alone. She looked at Harry. That is better than anything I wanted at 17. He stayed with that for a moment. Hermione appeared at his shoulder with the particular energy of someone who has been very professionally excellent for a long time and is now permitting herself to be pleased about it. She had a glass of champagne and the expression of a person at the end of a long run who is beginning to understand that they've arrived somewhere. 41, she said. 41, Harry agreed. I had a complete breakdown of scenarios mapped out for every number between 20 and 41. I had contingencies for 35 and contingencies for 38 and a separate contingency for the specific situation where the Nordic Council signed but the West African Congress didn't. She took a sip of champagne. None of my contingencies were for 41. What happens with 41? We just proceed. The implementation timeline holds. The council is formed. The first restoration conference is in July. She looked at him. No contingency needed. That sounds like the best possible outcome. It is entirely possible that I am not accustomed to the best possible outcome, she said, with a very specific kind of self-aware humor that Harry loved about her. I may need a day or two to adjust. Take the week, Harry said. She laughed, and the sound of it was the most normal thing in a room full of things that were extraordinary, and it was exactly right. He left the dinner at 10. Not because it was over, it wasn't, but because he'd done what he needed to do and the rest of the evening was the institution running itself, which was the point. He walked out of the assembly hall into the Vienna night, which was clear and cold and smelled of a city that had been doing its business for 1,000 years and intended to continue. He found a bridge over the Danube Canal and stood on it and looked at the water. He'd been standing there for about 10 minutes when he heard footsteps and wasn't surprised. He'd felt Riddle leave the dinner 2 minutes after him through the Compact's network, not following, but also walking, and in this general direction, which was possibly coincidence and possibly the particular pattern of two people who had been in close and complicated proximity for 6 months and had developed something like parallel instincts about where to go when they needed air. Riddle stood on the bridge beside him. They looked at the canal. The woman from the West African Congress, Harry said. She's going to be a problem for Grindelwald's appointment. She's going to be useful, Riddle said. She's the most rigorous critic in the room. If Grindelwald can get her signature on the appointment, it will be worth more than everyone else's combined. He paused. He knows that. He told me this afternoon that his strategy for the accountability process is to start with her. Does he have a strategy for winning her over? He said his strategy is to tell her the truth without managing her response, and then to listen to what she says. Riddle's voice had something in it that took Harry a moment to identify as a form of respect. He said he spent too many years managing people's responses. He finds it tedious now. That's growth, Harry said. Apparently. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about what you said in the library. In February. About the transfiguration question. Harry waited. Whether the transformed object retains continuity with the original. He looked at the water. I think the answer is yes. The material remembers. The bowl knows it was a cup. He paused. I'm not a different person than who I was. I don't think that's honest to claim. But the material remembers the transformation. He paused again, longer. What I did is in me the same way the cup is in the bowl. It doesn't disappear when the form changes. But the form has changed. Harry said nothing for a moment. I know, he said. I've known that for months. Maybe from the beginning. Then why? Because the cup being in the bowl is information, not a verdict, Harry said. It tells me what you're working with. It doesn't tell me what you make of it. He glanced at Riddle. And what you've made of it is in there. He nodded back toward the assembly hall, toward the charter and the 41 signatures and the working year that had preceded them. Riddle looked at the water for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, I used to think legacy was about what other people said about you after you were gone. I wanted a name that lasted. A pause. I didn't understand that legacy is what you leave behind that works. That genuinely works, without you holding it up. He looked at the hull. If this works, it'll work, Harry said. You can't know that. I know the people who built it, Harry said. That's enough. Riddle looked at him. You're unreasonably confident. I've been told that before. It's irritating. I know. It's also, Riddle stopped. Started again. It works. The confidence. I've watched it work for 6 months. Not because it's loud, you're not particularly loud about it. But because he searched for the word with the precision of a man for whom words were tools and imprecision was a genuine failing. Because it's real. It believes what it says. People can tell the difference, and they respond to it, and the thing gets built. He said it with the specific expression Harry had come to associate with him saying something true that he hadn't intended to say, something that had arrived before the usual architecture could filter it. Tom, Harry said. What? Thank you, Harry said. For the work. All of it. For doing it genuinely. The word genuinely was the important one and Riddle knew it. He was quiet for a moment in the specific way he was quiet when something had gotten through the architecture. Yes, he said. Which meant, you're welcome, and I know what you're thanking me for, and I receive it, and I don't know how to hold it gracefully yet but I'm trying. 6 months of learning Tom Riddle's vocabulary had made Harry reasonably fluent in the compressed language of that particular yes. They stood on the bridge until Hermione sent a charm pulse that meant where are you? Neville has found approximately 17 new colleagues and I'm going to need help getting him to leave. Harry sent back, on the canal bridge, coming back, tell him 5 more minutes. He got a charm pulse back that clearly indicated, that's what I told him 20 minutes ago. He pushed off the railing. Come on, he said. They walked back toward the hall, the Vienna night around them, the compact warm and settled inside his jacket in the way it had been since the assembly, the deep resolved warmth of a system that had found its purpose and was running cleanly on it. The months ahead were clear in Harry's mind. Not easy, there was nothing easy about what needed to be done. The governance structure needed a full operating cycle. The restoration program needed 12 more sites. Grindelwald's accountability process was going to be long and honest and painful and necessary. Riddle's theoretical foundations work was going to take years to fully articulate, which was probably appropriate for something built on the work of the most comprehensive dark magic mind of the century. Malikova's long-view analysis needed to be systematized in a way that the institution could access and use rather than simply consult. And somewhere in that future, a year away, perhaps 2, was the day when Harry would sit in a room with 4 bound lords and say honestly, it stands. And they would all agree, and the scaffold would come down, and the thing would either hold or it wouldn't. He was almost certain it would hold. And then he'd figure out what came next, which was a question he found he was genuinely curious about for the first time in as long as he could remember. Not dreading, not avoiding. Curious. He stepped back into the light of the assembly hall, where 41 delegations were talking about the work ahead, and Neville was being introduced to someone new, and Grindelwald was speaking to the woman from the West African Congress with the directness of a man who had decided that managing impressions was finished and truth was all he had left to offer, and she was listening with the quality of someone who had not yet decided what she thought but had decided the conversation was worth having. Harry stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. The compact in his jacket was warm. The network between 4 names ran through it with the clean hum of something that had found its purpose and was running toward it. The signed charter on the table was 41 pieces of genuine commitment from people who had come to Vienna not knowing what they'd find and had found something worth signing. Merlin and Slytherin had built a vault in the 6th century and waited 1500 years for a particular combination of blood and experience and intention to open it. Harry thought about that sometimes, about the patience of it, the faith it required, the trust that the right person would eventually exist. He thought they'd done well to trust that. He walked back in. The scaffold, in the end, came down in 14 months. The institution held. It was still holding, 30 years later, which was when Neville Longbottom's daughter asked her father what the original working room at Hogwarts had been like, and he'd thought about it for a moment and then said, loud, mostly. Very loud, and very full, and the kind of place where something was always being argued about or figured out or revised. Was it worth it? She asked. He'd looked at her, at his daughter, who was 17 and had all of his steadiness and something of his grandmother's fire, and he'd said, yes, it was worth it. All of it. Even the parts that were hard. Especially those, actually. She'd nodded and accepted this, the way his daughter accepted most things, directly, and without ceremony, and as a starting point for the next question. He'd smiled, and gone back to what he was doing, which was tending a garden that had once been a damaged substrate and was now the most extraordinary piece of botanical magical restoration in Europe. The day was warm. Things were growing.